Chapter 1 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 1. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky on the 12th day of February, 1809. The log cabin, which was his birthplace, was built on the south branch of Nolan's Creek, 3 miles from the village of Hodgensville, on land which was then in the county of Hardin, but is now located in that of LaRue. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was born in 1778. His mother's maiden name was Nancy Hanks. The Lincoln family, which appears to have been of unmixed English descent, came to Kentucky from Berks County, Pennsylvania, to which place tradition or conjecture asserts they had emigrated from Massachusetts. But they did not remain long in Pennsylvania, since they seem to have gone before 1752 to Rockingham County, Virginia, which state was then one with that of Kentucky. There is, however, so much doubt as to these details of their early history that it is not certain whether they were at first emigrants directly from England to Virginia, an offshoot of the historic Lincoln family in Massachusetts, or of the highly respectable Lincolns of Pennsylvania. This obscurity is plainly due to the great poverty and lowly station of the Virginian Lincolns. "My parents," said President Lincoln in a brief autobiographic sketch, "were both born of undistinguished families, second families, perhaps, I should say." To this he adds that his paternal grandfather was Abraham Lincoln, who migrated from Rockingham County, Virginia, to Kentucky, about 1781 or 2, although his cousins and other relatives all declare this grandsire's name to have been Mordecai, a striking proof of the ignorance and indifference of the family respecting matters seldom neglected. This grandfather, Abraham or Mordecai, having removed to Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground, settled in Mercer County. Their house was a rough log cabin, their farm a little clearing in the midst of the forest. One morning, not long after their settlement, the father took Thomas, his youngest son, and went to build a fence a short distance from the house, while the other brothers, Mordecai and Josiah, were sent to a field not far away. They were all intent upon their work, when a shot from a party of Indians in ambush was heard. The father fell dead. Josiah ran to a stockade, or settlement, 2 or 3 miles off. Mordecai, the eldest boy, made his way to the house, and, looking out from a loophole, saw an Indian in the act of raising his little brother from the ground. He took deliberate aim at a silver ornament on the breast of the Indian and brought him down. Thomas sprang towards the cabin, and was admitted by his mother, while Mordecai renewed his fire at several other Indians who rose from the covert of the fence or thicket. It was not long before Josiah returned from the stockade with a party of settlers, but the Indians had fled, and none were found but the dead one and another one who was wounded, and had crept into the top of a fallen tree. Mordecai, it is said, hated the Indians ever after with an intensity which was unusual even in those times. As Ellen Macaulay, in Waverley, is said to have hunted down the children of the mist, or as the Quaker Nathan, in Bird's romance of Nick of the Woods, is described as hunting the Shawnees, so are we told this other avenger of blood pursued his foes with unrelenting, unscrupulous hatred. For days together he would follow peaceable Indians as they passed through the settlements in order to get secret shots at them. Mordecai, the Indian killer, and his brother Josiah remained in Virginia and grew up to be respectable, prosperous men. The younger brother, Thomas, was always idle, thriftless, poor, a hunter, and a rover. He exercised occasionally, in a rough way, the calling of a carpenter, and, wandering from place to place, began at different times to cultivate the wilderness, but with little success, owing to his laziness. Yet he was a man of great strength and vigor, and once thrashed the monstrous bully of Breckinridge County in 3 minutes, and came off without a scratch. He was an inveterate talker, or popular teller of stories and anecdotes, and a Jackson Democrat in politics. which signified that he belonged to the more radical of the two political parties which then prevailed in America. In religion, he was, says Lamon, who derived his information from Mr. W. H. Herndon, nothing at times, and a member of various denominations by turns. In 1806 he lived at Elizabethtown in Hardin County, Kentucky, where, in the same year and place, he married Nancy Hanks. The exact date of the marriage is unknown. It is said of this young woman that she was a tall and beautiful brunette, with an understanding which, by her family at least, was considered wonderful. She could read and write, as rare accomplishments in those days in Kentucky backwoods as they still are among the poor whites of the South or their Western descendants. In later life she was sadly worn by hard labor, both in the house and fields, and her features were marked with a melancholy which was probably constitutional, and which her son inherited. It is to be regretted that President Abraham Lincoln never spoke, except with great reluctance, of his early life, or of his parents. As it is, the researches of W. H. Herndon and others have indicated the hereditary sources of his chief characteristics. We know that the grandfather was a vigorous backwoodsman who died a violent death, that his uncle was a grim and determined manslayer, carrying out for years the blood feud provoked by the murder of his parent, that his mother was habitually depressed, and that his father was a favorite of both men and women, though a mere savage when irritated, fond of fun, an endless storyteller, physically powerful, and hating hard work. Out of all of these preceding traits, it is not difficult to imagine how the giant Abraham came to be inflexible of purpose and strong of will, though indolent, why he was good-natured to excess in his excess of strength, and why he was a great humorist, and at the same time a melancholy man. It should be remembered by the reader that the state of society in which Abraham Lincoln was born and grew up resembled nothing now existing in Europe, and that it is very imperfectly understood even by many town-dwelling Americans. The people around him were all poor and ignorant, yet they bore their poverty lightly, were hardly aware of their want of culture, and were utterly unconscious of owing the least respect or deference to any human being. Some among them were, of course, aware of the advantages to be derived from wealth and political power, but the majority knew not how to spend the one, and were indifferent to the other. Even to this day there are, in the South and Southwest, scores of thousands of men who, owning vast tracts of fertile land, and gifted with brains and muscle, will not take the pains to build themselves homes better than the ordinary cabins, or cultivate more soil than will supply life with plain and unvaried sustenance. The only advantage they have is the inestimable one, if treated properly, of being free from all trammels save those of ignorance. To rightly appreciate the good or evil qualities of men molded in such society requires great generosity and great freedom from all that is conventional. Within the first few years of her married life, Nancy Hanks Lincoln bore her husband 3 children. The first was a daughter named Sarah, who married at 15 and died soon after. The second was Abraham, and the third Thomas, who died in infancy. The family were always wretchedly poor, even below the level of their neighbors in want, and as the father was indolent, the wife was obliged to labor and suffer. But it is probable that Miss Lincoln, who could read, and Thomas, who attributed his failure in life to ignorance, wished their children to be educated. Schools were, of course, scarce in a country where the houses were often many miles apart. Zechariah Riney, a Catholic priest, was Abraham's first teacher. His next was Caleb Hazel. The young pupil learned to read and write in a few weeks, but in all his life, reckoning his instruction by days, he only had 1 year's schooling. When Thomas Lincoln was first married, 1806, he took his wife to live in Elizabethtown, in a wretched shed, which has since been used as a slaughter-house and stable. About a year after, he removed to Noland's Creek. 4 years after the birth of Abraham, 1809, he again migrated to a more picturesque and fertile place, a few miles distant on Knob Creek. Here he remained 4 years, and though he was the occupant of over 200 acres of good land, never cultivated more than a little patch, being satisfied with milk and meal for food. When his children went to school, they walked 8 miles, going and returning, having only maize bread for dinner. In 1816, the father, after having sold his interest in the farm for 10 barrels of whiskey and $20, built himself a crazy flatboat and set sail alone on the Ohio, seeking for a new home. By accident, the boat foundered, and much of the cargo was lost, but Thomas Lincoln pushed on, and found a fitting place to settle in Indiana, near the spot on which the village of Gentryville now stands. It was in the untrodden wilderness, and here he soon after brought his family, to live for the first year in what is called a half-faced camp, or a rough hut of poles, of which only 3 sides were enclosed, the 4th being open to the air. In 1817, Betsy Sparrow, an aunt of Mrs. Lincoln, and her husband Thomas, with a nephew named Dennis Hanks, joined the Lincolns, who were moved to a better house, if that could be called a house, which was built of rough logs, and had neither floor, door, nor window. For 2 years they continued to live in this manner. Lincoln, a carpenter, was too lazy to make himself the simplest furniture. They had a few 3-legged stools. The only bed was made in a singular manner. Its head and one side were formed by a corner of the cabin. The bed post was a single crotch cut from the forest. Laid upon this crotch were the ends of 2 hickory poles, whose other extremities were placed in 2 holes made in the logs of the wall. On these sticks rested slats, or boards rudely split from trees with an axe, and on these slats was laid a bag filled with dried leaves. This was the bed of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, and into it, when the skins hung at the cabin entrance did not keep out the cold, little Abraham and his sister crept for warmth. Very little is recorded of the childhood of the future president. He was once nearly drowned in a stream, and when 8 years of age, shot a wild turkey which, he declared in after life, was the largest game he had ever killed. A remarkable statement for a man who had grown up in a deer country, where buckskin formed the common material for clothing, and venison hams passed for money. One thing is at least certain, that, till he was 10 years old, the poor boy was ill-clad, dirty, and ill-used by his father. He had, however, learned to write. In 1818, a terrible but common epidemic, known in Western America as the milk fever, broke out in Indiana, and within a few days Thomas and Betsy Sparrow and Mrs. Lincoln all died. They had no medical attendance, and it was 9 months before a clergyman, named David Elkin, invited by the first letter which Abraham ever wrote, came 100 miles to hold the funeral service and preach over the graves. Strange as it may seem, the event which is universally regarded as the saddest of every life, in the case of Abraham Lincoln, led directly to greater happiness, and to a change which conduced to the development of all his better qualities. 13 months after the death of Nancy Lincoln, Thomas married a widow, Mrs. Johnston, whom he had wooed ineffectively in Kentucky when she was Miss Sally Bush. She was a woman of sense, industrious, frugal, and gifted with a pride which inspired her to lead a far more civilized life than that which satisfied poor Tom Lincoln. He had greatly exaggerated to her the advantages of his home in Indiana, and she was bitterly disappointed when they reached it. Fortunately, she owned a stock of good furniture, which greatly astonished little Abraham and Sarah and their cousin Dennis. She set about mending matters with great energy, and made her husband put down a floor and hang windows and doors. It was in the depth of winter, and the children, as they nestled in the warm beds she had provided, enjoying the strange luxury of security from the cold winds of December, must have thanked her from the depths of their hearts. She had brought a son and 2 daughters of her own, but Abraham and his sister had an equal place in her affections. They were half naked, and she clad them. They were dirty, and she washed them. They had been ill-used, and she treated them with motherly tenderness. In her own language, she made them look a little more human. This excellent woman loved Abraham tenderly, and her love was warmly returned. After his death she declared to Mr. Herndon, "I can say what not one mother in 10,000 can of a boy. Abe never gave me a cross look, and never refused, in fact or appearance, to do anything I requested him. Nor did I ever give him a cross word in all my life. His mind and mine, what little I had, seemed to run together. He was dutiful to me always. Abe was the best boy I ever saw, or ever expect to see. When in after years Mr. Lincoln spoke of his saintly mother and of his angel of a mother, he referred to this noble woman, who first made him feel like a human being, whose goodness first touched his childish heart, and taught him that blows and taunts and degradation were not to be his only portion in the world. And if it be recorded of George Washington that he never told a lie, it should also be remembered of Abraham Lincoln, who carried his country safely through a greater crisis than that of the Revolutionary War, that he always obeyed his mother. Abraham had gone to school only a few weeks in Kentucky, and Mrs. Lincoln soon sent him again to receive instruction. His first teacher in Indiana was Hazel Dorsey, his next Andrew Crawford. The latter, in addition to the ordinary branches of education, also taught manners. One scholar would be introduced by another, while walking round the log schoolroom, to all the boys and girls, taught to bow properly, and otherwise acquire the ordinary courtesies of life. Abraham distinguished himself in spelling, which has always been a favorite subject for competition in rural America, and he soon began to write short original articles, though composition formed no part of the studies. It was characteristic of the boy that his first essays were against cruelty to animals. His mates were in the habit of catching the box turtles, or land terrapins, or tortoises, and putting live coals on their backs to make them walk, which greatly annoyed Abraham. All who knew him, in boyhood or in later life, bear witness that this tenderness was equal to his calm courage and tremendous physical strength. The last school which he attended for a short time, and to reach which he walked every day 9 miles, was kept by a Mr. Swaney. This was in 1826. Abraham was now 16 years of age, and had grown so rapidly that he had almost attained the height which he afterwards reached of 6 feet 4 inches. He was very dark, his skin was shriveled even in boyhood by constant exposure, and he habitually wore low shoes, a linsey-woolsey shirt, a cap made from the skin of a raccoon or possum, and buckskin breeches, which were invariably about 12 inches too short for him. When not working for his father, he was hired out as a farm laborer to the neighbors. His cousin, John Hanks, says, "We worked barefoot, grubbed it, plowed, mowed, and cradled together." All who knew him at this time testify that Abraham hated hard work, though he did it well, that he was physically indolent, though intellectually very active, that he loved to laugh, tell stories, and joke while laboring, and that he passed his leisure moments in hard study or in reading, which he made hard by writing out summaries of all he read, and getting them by heart. He would study arithmetic at night by the light of the fire, and cipher or copy with a pencil or coal on the wooden shovel or on a board. When this was full, he would shave it off with his father's drawing knife, and begin again. When he had paper, he used it instead, but in the frequent intervals when he had none, the boards were kept until paper was obtained. Among the first books which he read and thoroughly mastered were Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Process, a History of the United States, Weem's Life of Washington, and the Revised Statutes of Indiana. From another work, The Kentucky Preceptor, a collection of literary extracts, he is said by a Mrs. Crawford, who knew him well, to have learned his school orations, speeches, and pieces to write. The field work, which Abraham Lincoln disliked, did not, however, exhaust his body, and his mind found relief after toil in mastering anything in print. It is not unusual to see poor and ignorant youths, who are determined to get learning, apply themselves to the hardest and driest intellectual labor with very little discrimination of any difference between that and more attractive literature, and it is evident that young Lincoln worked in this spirit. There is no proof that his memory was by nature extraordinary. It would rather seem that the contrary was the case, from the pains which he took to improve it. During his boyhood, any book had to him all the charm of rarity. Perhaps it was the more charming because most of his friends believed that mental culture was incompatible with industry. Lincoln, said his cousin Dennis Hanks, was lazy, a very lazy man. He was always reading, scribbling, writing, ciphering, writing poetry, and the like. It is evident that his custom of continually exercising his memory on all subjects grew with his growth and strengthened with his strength. By the time he was 25, he had, without instruction, made himself a good lawyer, not a mere case practitioner, but one who argued from a sound knowledge of principles. It is said that when he began to read Blackstone, he thoroughly learned the first 40 pages at one sitting. There is also sufficient proof that he had perfectly mastered not only Euclid's geometry, but a number of elementary scientific works, among others one on astronomy. And many anecdotes of his later life prove that he had learned nothing without thinking it over deeply, especially in all its relations to his other acquisitions and its practical use. If education consists of mental discipline and the acquisition of knowledge, it is idle to say that Abraham Lincoln was uneducated, since few college graduates actually excelled him in either respect. These facts deserve dwelling on, since, in the Golden Book of Self-Made Men, there is not one who presents a more encouraging example to youth, and especially to the poor and ambitious, than Abraham Lincoln. He developed his memory by resolutely training it. He brought out his reasoning powers as a lawyer by using his memory. He became a fluent speaker and a ready reasoner by availing himself to every opportunity to speak or debate. From the facts which have been gathered by his biographers, or which are current in conversation among those who knew him, it is most evident that there seldom lived a man who owed so little to innate genius or talents in comparison to what he achieved by sheer determination and perseverance. When Abraham was 15 or 16, he began to exercise his memory in a new direction, by frequenting not only religious but political meetings, and by mounting the stump of a tree the day after and repeating with great accuracy all he had heard. It is said that he mimicked with great skill not only the tones of preachers and orators, but also their gestures and facial expressions. Anything like cruelty to man or beast would always inspire him to an original address, in which he would preach vigorously against inflicting pain. Wherever he spoke, an audience was sure to assemble, and as this frequently happened in the harvest field, the youthful orator or actor was often dragged down by his angry father and driven to his work. His wit and humor, his inexhaustible fund of stories, and, above all, his kind heart, made him everywhere a favorite. Women, says Mr. Lamon, were especially pleased, for he was always ready to do any kind of work for them, such as chopping wood, making a fire, or nursing a baby. Any family was glad when he was hired to work with them, since he did his work well, and made them all merry while he was about it. In 1825, he was employed by James Taylor as a ferryman, to manage a boat which crossed the Ohio and Anderson's Creek. In addition to this, he worked on the farm, acted as hostler, ground corn, built the fires, put the water early on the fire, and prepared for the mistress's cooking. Though he was obliged to rise so early, he always studied till nearly midnight. He was in great demand when hogs were slaughtered. For this rough work he was paid 31 cents, about $16 a day. Meanwhile, he became incredibly strong. He could carry 600 pounds with ease. He once picked up some huge posts which 4 men were about to lift, and bore them away with little effort. Men yet alive have seen him lift a full barrel of liquor and drink from the bunghole. He could sink an axe, said an old friend, deeper into wood than any man I ever saw. He was especially skilled in wrestling, and from the year 1828 there was no man, far or near, who would compete with him in it. From his boyhood he was extremely temperate. Those who have spoken most freely about his faults admit that, in a country where a whiskey jug was kept in every house, Lincoln never touched spirits except to avoid giving offense. His stepmother thought he was temperate to a fault. Meanwhile, as the youth grew apace, the neighboring village of Gentryville had grown with him. Books and cultivated society became more accessible. The great man of the place was a Mr. Jones, the shopkeeper, whose shop supplied all kinds of goods required by farmers. Mr. Jones took a liking to young Lincoln, employed him sometimes, taught him politics, giving him deep impressions in favor of Andrew Jackson, the representative of the Democratic Party, and finally awoke Abraham's ambition by admiring him, and predicting that he would some day be a great man. Another friend was John Baldwin, the village blacksmith, who was, even for a Western American wag, wonderfully clever at a jest, and possessed of an inexhaustible fund of stories. It was from John Baldwin that Lincoln derived a great number of the quaint anecdotes with which he was accustomed in after years to illustrate his arguments. His memory contained thousands of these drolleries, so that, eventually, there was no topic of conversation which did not put him in mind of a little story. In some other respects, his acquisitions were less useful. Though he knew a vast number of ballads, he could not sing one, and though a reader of Burns, certain of his own satires and songs, levelled at some neighbors who had slighted him, were mere doggerel, wanting every merit, and very bitter. But, about 1827, he contributed an article on temperance and another on American politics to two newspapers published in Ohio. From the praise awarded by a lawyer named Bichard to the political article, it would appear to have been very well written. Even in this first essay in politics, Lincoln urged the principle by which he became famous, and for which he died, adherence to the Constitution and the integrity of the American Union. In March 1828, Abraham Lincoln was hired by Mr. Gentry, the proprietor of Gentryville, as bow hand, and to work the front oars, on a boat going with a cargo of bacon to New Orleans. This was a trip of 1,800 miles, and then, as now, the life of an Ohio and Mississippi boatman was full of wild adventure. One incident which befell the future president was sufficiently strange. Having arrived at a sugar plantation 6 miles below Baton Rouge, the boat was poled in, and Lincoln, with his companion, a son of Mr. Gentry, went to sleep. Hearing footsteps in the night, they sprang up and saw that a gang of 7 negroes were coming on board to rob or murder. Seizing a handspike, Lincoln rushed towards them, and as the leader jumped on the boat, knocked him into the water. The second, third, and fourth, as they leapt aboard, were served in the same way, and the others fled, but were pursued by Lincoln and Gentry, who inflicted on them a severe beating. In this encounter, Abraham received a wound the scar of which he bore through life. It is very probable that among these negroes who would have taken the life of the future champion of emancipation, there were some who lived to share its benefits and weep for his death. It was during this voyage, or about this time, that 2 strangers paid Abraham half a silver dollar each for rowing them ashore in a boat. Relating this to Mr. Seward, Secretary of State, he said, "You may think it was a very little thing, but it was a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely believe that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. I was a more hopeful and confident being from that time." End of Chapter 1. Recording by John. Chapter 2 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 2. In 1830, Thomas Lincoln had again tired of his home and resolved to move westward. This time he did not change without good reason. An epidemic had appeared in his Indiana neighborhood, which was besides generally unhealthy. Therefore, in the spring, he and Abraham, with Dennis Hanks and Levi Hall, who had married one of Mrs. Lincoln's daughters by her first husband, with their families, 13 in all, having packed their furniture on a wagon drawn by 4 oxen, took the road for Illinois. After journeying 200 miles in 15 days, Thomas Lincoln settled in Moron County, on the Sangamon River, about 10 miles west of Decatur. Here they built a cabin of hewn timber, with a smokehouse for drying meat, and a stable, and broke up and fenced 15 acres of land. Abraham Lincoln was now 21, and his father had been a hard master, taking all his wages. He therefore, after doing his best to settle the family in their new home, went forth to work for himself among the farmers. One George Cluse, who worked with Abraham during the first year in Illinois, says that at that time he was the roughest-looking person he ever saw. He was tall, angular, and ungainly, and wore trousers of flax and tow, cut tight at the ankle and out at the knees. He was very poor, and made a bargain with Miss Nancy Miller to split 400 rails for every yard of brown jean, dyed with walnut bark, that would be required to make him a pair of trousers. Thomas Lincoln found, in less than a year, that his new home was the most unhealthy of all he had tried. So he went westward again, moving to 3 new places until he settled at Goose Nest Prairie in Coles County, where he died at the age of 73, as usual, in debt. From the time of his death, and as he advanced in prosperity, Abraham aided his stepmother in many ways besides sending her money. It was at Decatur that he made his first public speech, standing on a keg. It was on the navigation of the Sangamon River, and was delivered extemporaneously in reply to one by a candidate for the legislature named Posey. During the winter of 1831, a trader named Denton Offutt proposed to John Hanks, Abraham Lincoln, and John D. Johnston, his stepmother's son, to take a flatboat to New Orleans. The wages offered were very high, 50 cents a day to each man, and $60 to be divided among them at the end of the trip. After some delay, the boat, loaded with corn, pigs, and pork, sailed, but just below New Salem, on the Sangamon, it stuck on a dam, but was saved by the great ingenuity of Lincoln, who invented a novel apparatus for getting it over. This seems to have turned his mind to the subject of overcoming such difficulties of navigation, and in 1849 he obtained a patent for an improved method of lifting vessels over shoals. The design is a bellows attached to each side of the hull, below the waterline, to be pumped full of air when it is desired to lift the craft over a shoal. The model, which is 18 or 20 inches long, and which is now in the Patent Office at Washington, appears to have been cut with a knife from a shingle in a cigar box. John Hanks, apparently a most trustworthy and excellent man, declared that it was during this trip, while at New Orleans, Lincoln first saw negroes chained, maltreated, and whipped. It made a deep impression on his humane mind, and, years after, he often declared that witnessing this cruelty first induced him to think slavery wrong. At New Orleans, the flatboat discharged its cargo and was sold for its timber. Lincoln returned on a steamboat to St. Louis, and thence walked home. He had hardly returned before he received a challenge from a famous wrestler named Daniel Needham. There was a great assembly at Wabash Point to witness the match, where Needham was thrown with so much ease that his pride was more hurt than his body. In July 1831, Abraham again engaged himself to Mr. Offutt to take charge of a county store in New Salem. While awaiting his employer, an election was held, and a clerk was wanted at the polls. The stranger, Abraham, being asked whether he was competent to fill the post, said, "I will try," and performed the duties well. This was the first public official act of his life, and as soon as Offutt's goods arrived, Lincoln, from a day laborer, became a clerk, or rather salesman, in which capacity he remained for 1 year, or until the spring of 1832, when his employer failed. Many incidents are narrated of Lincoln's honesty towards customers during this clerkship, of his strict integrity in trifles, his bravery when women were annoyed by bullies, and of his prowess against a gang of ruffians who infested and ruled the town. He is said to have more than once walked several miles after business hours to return 6 cents, or some equally trifling sum, when he had been overpaid. It is very evident that he managed all matters with so much tact as to make fast friends of everybody, and was specially a favorite of the men with whom he fought. It was now that he began to cultivate popularity, quietly, but with the same determination which he had shown in acquiring knowledge. To his credit be it said, that he effected this neither by flattery nor servility, but by making the most of his good qualities, and by inducing respect for his honesty, intelligence, and bravery. It is certain that, during a year, Mr. Offutt was continually stimulating his ambition, and insisting he knew more than any man in the United States, and would some day be president. Lincoln himself knew very well by this time of what stuff many of the men were made who rose in politics, and that, with a little luck and perseverance, he could hold his own with them. When out of the store, he was always busy, as of old, in the pursuit of knowledge. He mastered the English grammar, remarking that, if that was what they called a science, he thought he could subdue another. A Mr. Green, who became his fellow clerk, declares that his talk now showed that he was beginning to think of a great life and a great destiny. He busied himself very much with debating clubs, walking many miles to attend them, and for years continued to take the Louisville Journal, famous for the lively wit of its editor, George D. Prentice, and for this newspaper he paid regularly when he had not the means to buy decent clothing. From this time his life rapidly increases in interest. It is certain that, from early youth, he had quietly determined to become great, and that he thoroughly tested his own talents and acquirements before entering upon politics as a career. His chief, and indeed his almost only talent was resolute perseverance, and by means of it he passed in the race of life thousands who were his superiors in genius. Among all the biographies of the great and wise and good among mankind, there is not one so full of encouragement to young poor men as that of Abraham Lincoln, since there is not one which so illustrates not only how mere personal success may be attained, but how by strong will and self-culture the tremendous task of guiding a vast country through the trials of a civil war may be successfully achieved. In the spring of 1832, Mr. Offutt failed, and Lincoln had nothing to do. For some time past, an Indian rebellion, led by the famous Black Hawk, chief of the Sac tribe, had caused the greatest alarm in the western states. About the beginning of this century, 1804 through 1805, the Sacs had been removed west of the Mississippi, but Black Hawk, believing that his people had been unjustly exiled, organized a conspiracy for which a while embraced 9 of the most powerful tribes of the Northwest, and announced his intention of returning and settling in the old hunting grounds of his people on the Rock River. He was a man of great courage and shrewdness, skilled as an orator, and dreaded as one gifted with supernatural power, combining in his person the war chief and prophet. But the returning Indians, by committing great barbarities on the way, caused such irritation and alarm among the white settlers that when Governor Reynolds of Illinois issued a call for volunteers, several regiments of hardy frontiersmen were at once formed. Black Hawk's allies, with the exception of the tribe of the Foxes, at once fell away, but their desperate leader kept on in his course. Among the companies which volunteered was one from Menard County, embracing many men from New Salem. The captain was chosen by vote, and the choice fell on Lincoln. He was accustomed to say, when president, that nothing in his life had ever gratified him so much as this promotion. And this may well have been, since, to a very ambitious man, the first practical proofs of popularity are like the first installment of a great fortune paid to one who is poor. Though he was never in an actual engagement during this campaign, Lincoln underwent much hunger and hardship while it lasted, and at times had great trouble with his men, who were not only mere raw militia, but also unusually rough and rebellious. One incident of the war, however, as narrated by Lamon, not only indicates that Abraham Lincoln was sometimes in danger, but was well qualified to grapple with it. One day, during these many marches and countermarches, an old Indian, weary, hungry, and helpless, found his way into the camp. He professed to be a friend of the whites, and although it was an exceedingly perilous experiment for one of his color, he ventured to throw himself upon the mercy of the soldiers. But the men first murmured, and then broke out into fierce cries for his blood. "We have come out to fight Indians," they said, "and we intend to do it." The poor Indian, now in the extremity of his distress and peril, did what he should have done before. He threw down before his assailants a soiled and crumpled paper, which he implored them to read before taking his life. It was a letter of character and safe conduct from General Cass, pronouncing him a faithful man, who had done good service in the cause for which this army was enlisted. But it was too late. The men refused to read it, or thought it a forgery, and were rushing with fury upon the defenseless old savage, when Captain Lincoln bounded between them and their appointed victim. "Men," said he, and his voice for a moment stilled the agitation around him, "this must not be done. He must not be shot and killed by us." "But," said some of them, "the Indian is a spy." Lincoln knew that his own life was now in only less danger than that of the poor creature that crouched behind him. During this scene, the towering form and the passion and resolution in Lincoln's face produced an effect upon the furious mob. They paused, listened, fell back, and then sullenly obeyed what seemed to be the voice of reason as well as authority. But there were still some murmurs of disappointed rage, and half-suppressed exclamations which looked towards vengeance of some kind. At length one of the men, a little bolder than the rest, but evidently feeling that he spoke for the whole, cried out, "This is cowardly on your part, Lincoln. If any man think I am a coward, let him test it," was the reply. "Lincoln," responded a new voice, "you are larger and heavier than we are." "This you can guard against. Choose your weapons," returned the captain. Whatever may be said of Mr. Lincoln's choice of means for the preservation of military discipline, it was certainly very effectual in this case. There was no more disaffection in his camp, and the word coward was never coupled with his name again. Mr. Lincoln understood his men better than those who would be disposed to criticize his conduct. He has often declared himself that his life and character were both at stake, and would probably have been lost, had he not at that supremely critical moment forgotten the officer and asserted the man. The soldiers, in fact, could not have been arrested, tried, or punished. They were merely wild backwoodsmen, acting entirely by their own will, and any effort to court-martial them would simply have failed in its object, and made their captain seem afraid of them. During this campaign, Lincoln made the acquaintance of a lawyer, then captain, the Hon. T. Stewart, who had subsequently a great influence on his career. When the company was mustered out in May, Lincoln at once re-enlisted as a private in a volunteer spy company, where he remained for a month, until the Battle of Bad Axe, which resulted in the capture of Black Hawk, put an end to hostilities. This war was not a remarkable affair, says J. G. Holland, but it was remarkable in that the two simplest, homeliest, and truest men engaged in it afterwards became Presidents of the United States, namely, General, then Colonel, Zachary Taylor, and Abraham Lincoln. It has always been usual in the United States to urge to the utmost the slightest military services rendered by candidates for office. The absurd degree to which this was carried often awoke the satire of Lincoln, even when it was at his own expense. Many years after, he referred thus humorously to his military services. "By the way, Mr. Speaker, did you know I was a military hero? Yes, sir. In the days of the Black Hawk War I fought, bled, and came away. Speaking of General Cass's career reminds me of my own. I was not at Sullivan's defeat, but I was about as near to it as Cass was to Hull's surrender, and, like him, I saw the place soon after. It is quite certain that I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent my musket pretty bad on one occasion. If Cass broke his sword, the idea is he broke it in desperation. I bent the musket by accident. If General Cass went in advance of me in picking whortleberries, I guess I surpass him in charges upon the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did, but I had a great many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and, although I never fainted from loss of blood, I certainly can say I was often very hungry." The soldiers from Sangamon County arrived home just 10 days before the state election, and Lincoln was immediately applied to for permission to place his name among the candidates for the legislature. He canvassed the district, but was defeated, though he received the almost unanimous vote of his own precinct. The young man had, however, made a great advance even by defeat, since he became known by it as one whose sterling honesty had deserved a better reward. Lincoln's integrity was, in this election, strikingly evinced by his adherence to his political principles. Had he been less scrupulous, he would not have lost the election. At this time there were two great political parties, the Democratic, headed by Andrew Jackson, elected president in 1832, and that which had been the Federalist, but which was rapidly being called Whig. The Democratic party warred against a national bank, paper money, monopolies, or privileged and chartered institutions, a protective tariff, and internal improvements, and was, in short, jealous of all public expenditure which could tend to greatly enrich individuals. Its leader, Jackson, was a man of inflexible determination and unquestionable bravery, which he had shown not only in battle, but by subduing the incipient rebellion in South Carolina, when that state had threatened to nullify or secede from the Union. Lincoln's heart was with Jackson. He had unbounded admiration for the man, but he knew that the country needed internal improvements, and in matters of political economy, inclined to the Whigs. After returning from the army, he went to live in the house of W. H. Herndon, a most estimable man, to whose researches the world owes nearly all that is known of Lincoln's early life and family, and who was subsequently his law partner. At this time the late captain thought of becoming a blacksmith, but as an opportunity occurred of buying a store in New Salem on credit, he became in company with a man named Barry, a country merchant or trader. He showed little wisdom in associating himself with Barry, who proved a drunkard and ruined the business, after a year of anxiety, leaving Lincoln in debt, which he struggled to pay off through many years of trouble. It was not until 1849 that the last note was discharged. His creditors were, however, considerate and kind. While living with Mr. Herndon, Lincoln began to study law seriously. He had previously read Blackstone, and by one who has really mastered this grand compendium of English law, the profession is already half acquired. He was still very poor, and appears to have lived by helping a Mr. Ellis in his shop, and to have received much willing aid from friends, especially John T. Stuart, who always cheerfully supplied his wants, and lent him law books. About this time, Lincoln attracted the attention of a noted Democrat, John Calhoun, the surveyor of Sangamon County, who afterwards became famous as president of the Lecompton Council in Kansas during the disturbances between friends and opponents of slavery prior to the admission of the state. He liked Lincoln, and, wanting a really honest assistant, recommended him to learn surveying, lending him a book for the purpose. In 6 weeks he had qualified himself, and soon acquired a small private business. On the 7th May, 1833, Lincoln was appointed postmaster at New Salem. As the mail arrived but once a week, neither the duties or emoluments of the office were such as to greatly disturb or delight him. He is said, indeed, to have kept the letters in his hat, being at once, in his own person, both office and officer. The advantages which he gained were opportunities to read the newspapers, which he did aloud to the assembled inhabitants, and to decipher letters for all who could not read. All of this was conducive, in a creditable way, to notoriety and popularity, and he improved it as such. In the autumn of 1834 a great trouble occurred. His scanty property, consisting of the horse, saddle, bridle, and surveyor's instruments by which he lived, were seized under a judgment on one of the notes which he had given for the store. But two good friends, named Short and Bowlin Green, bought them in for $245, which Lincoln faithfully repaid in due time. It is said that he was an accurate surveyor, and remarkable for his truthfulness. He never speculated in lands, nor availed himself of endless opportunities to profit by aiding the speculations of others. Miserably poor and badly clad, Lincoln, though very fond of the society of women, was sensitive and shy when they were strangers. Mr. Ellis, the storekeeper for whom he often worked, states that, when he lived with him at the tavern, there came a lady from Virginia with 3 stylish daughters, who remained a few weeks. During their stay, I do not remember Mr. Lincoln ever eating at the same table where they did. I thought it was on account of his awkward appearance and wearing apparel. There are many anecdotes recorded of this kind, showing at this period his poverty, his popularity, and his kindness of heart. He was referee, umpire, and unquestioned judge in all disputes, horse races, or wagers. One who knew him in this capacity said of him, "He is the fairest man I ever had to deal with." In 1834, Lincoln again became a successful candidate for the legislature of Illinois, receiving a larger majority than any other candidate on the ticket. A friend, Colonel Smoot, lent him $200 to make a decent appearance, and he went to the seat of government properly dressed, for, perhaps, the first time in his life. During the session he said very little, but worked hard and learned much. He was on the Committee for Public Accounts and Expenditures, and when the session was at an end, quietly walked back to his work. Lamon relates, at full length, that at this time Lincoln was in love with a young lady who died of a broken heart in 1835, not, however, for Lincoln, but for another young man who had been engaged to and abandoned her. At her death, Lincoln seemed for some weeks nearly insane, and was never the same man again. From this time he lost his youth, and became subject to frequent attacks of intense mental depression, resulting in that settled melancholy which never left him. In 1836 he was again elected to the legislature. Political excitement at this time ran high. The country was being settled rapidly, and people's minds were wild with speculation in lands and public works, from which every man hoped for wealth, and which were to be developed by the legislatures. Lincoln's colleagues were in an unusual degree able men, and the session was a busy one. It was during the canvass of 1836 that he made his first really great speech. He had by this time fairly joined the new Whig party, and it was in reply to a Democrat, Dr. Early, that he spoke. From that day he was recognized as one of the most powerful orators in the state. The principal object of this session, in accordance with the popular mania, was internal improvements, and to this subject Lincoln had been devoted for years. The representatives from Sangamon County consisted of 9 men of great influence, every one at least 6 feet in height, whence they were known as the Long Nine. The friends of the adoption of a general system of internal improvements wished to secure the aid of the Long Nine, but the latter refused to aid them unless the removal of the capital of the state from Vandalia to Springfield should be made part of the measure. The result was that both the bill for removal and that for internal improvements, involving the indebtedness of the state for many millions of dollars, passed the same day. Lincoln was the leader in these improvements, and was a most laborious member, instant in season and out of season, for the great measures of the Whig party. At the present day, though grave doubts may exist as to the expediency of such reckless and radical legislation, there could be none as to the integrity or good faith of Abraham Lincoln. He did not enrich himself by it, though it is not impossible that, in legislation, as in land surveying, others swindled on his honesty. It was during this session that Lincoln first beheld Stephen Douglas, who was destined to become, for 20 years, his most formidable opponent. Douglas, from his diminutive stature and great mind, was afterwards popularly known as the Little Giant. Lincoln merely recorded his first impressions of Douglas by saying he was the least man he ever saw. This legislation of 1836 to 37 was indeed of a nature to attract speculators, whether in finance or politics. Within a few days, it passed 2 loans amounting to $12 million, and chartered 1,300 miles of railway, with canals, bridges, and river improvements in full proportion. The capital stock of 2 banks was increased by nearly $5 million, which the state took, leaving it to the banks to manage the railroad and canal funds. Everything was undertaken on a colossal and daring scale by the legislatures, who were principally managed by the Long Nine, who were in their turn chiefly directed by Lincoln. The previous session had been to him only as the green room in which to prepare himself for the stage. When he made his first appearance in the political ballet, it was certainly with such a great leap as had never before been witnessed in any beginner. The internal improvement scheme involved not only great boldness and promptness in its execution, but also a vast amount of that practical business talent in which most Western men and Yankees were instinctively proficient. With all this, there was incessant hard work and great excitement. Through the turmoil, Lincoln passed like one in his true element. He had at last gotten into the life which he aspired for years, and was probably as happy as his constitutional infirmity of melancholy would permit. He was, it is true, no man of business in the ordinary sense, but he understood the general principles of business, and was skilled in availing himself in others of talents which he did not possess. During this session he put on record his first anti-slavery protest. It was, in the words of Lamon, a very mild beginning, but it required uncommon courage, and is interesting as indicating the principle upon which his theory of emancipation was afterwards carried out. At this time the whole country, North as well as South, was becoming excited concerning the doctrines and practices of the small but very rapidly growing body of abolitionists, who were attacking slavery with fiery zeal, and provoking in return the most deadly hatred. The abolitionist, carrying the Republican theory to its logical extreme, insisted that all men, white or black, were entitled to the same political and social rights. The slave owners honestly believed that society should consist of strata, the lowest of which should be bondmen. The abolitionists did not recognize that slavery in America, like serfdom in Russia, had developed into a culture a country which would, without it, have remained a wilderness. Nor did the slave theorists recognize that a time must infallibly come when both systems of enforced labor must yield to new forms of industrial development. The abolitionists, taking their impressions from the early English and Quaker philanthropists, thought principally of the personal wrong inflicted on the Negro, while the majority of Americans declared, with equal conviction, that the blacks' sufferings were not so much account that white man should be made to suffer much more for them, and the whole country be possibly overwhelmed in civil war. Even at this early period of the dispute, there were, however, in the old Whig party, a few men who thought that the growing strife was not to be stopped simply by crushing the abolitionists. But while they would have gladly seen the latter abate their furious zeal, they also thought that slavery might, with propriety, be at least checked in its progress, since they had observed, with grave misgiving, that wherever it was planted, only an aristocracy flourished, while the poor white men became utterly degraded. Such were the views of Abraham Lincoln, views which, in after years, led, during the sharp and bitter need of the war, to the formation of the theory of emancipation for the sake of the country, as opposed to mere abolition for the sake of the Negro, which had had its turn and fulfilled its mission. The feeling against the abolitionists were very bitter in Illinois. Many other states had passed severe resolutions, recommending that anti-slavery agitation be made an indictable offense or a misdemeanor, and, in May 1836, Congress declared that all future abolition petitions should be laid on the table without discussion. But when the legislature of Illinois took its turn in the fashion, and passed resolutions of the same kind, Abraham Lincoln presented to the House a protest which he could get but one man, Dan Stone, to sign. Perhaps he did not want any more signatures, for he was one of those who foresaw to what this cloud, no larger than a man's hand, would in future years extend, and was willing to be alone as a prophet. The protest was as follows. March 3rd, 1837. The following protest was presented to the House, which was read and ordered to be spread on the journals, to wit: Resolutions upon the subject of domestic slavery, having passed both branches of the General Assembly at its present session, the undersigned hereby protest against the passage of the same. They believe that the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy, but that the promulgation of abolition doctrines tends rather to increase than abate its evils. They believe that the Congress of the United States has no power under the Constitution to interfere with the institution of slavery in the different states. They believe that the Congress of the United States has the power, under the Constitution, to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, but that the power ought not to be exercised unless at the request of the people of the district. The difference between these opinions and those contained in the said resolutions is their reason for entering this protest. Signed, Dan Stone, Abraham Lincoln, representatives from the county of Sangamon. This was indeed a very mild protest, but it was the beginning of that which, in after years, grew to be the real emancipation of the Negro. Never in history was so fine an end of the wedge succeeded by such a wide cleaving bulk. Much as Lincoln afterwards accomplished for the abolition of slavery, he never, says Holland, became more extreme in his views than the words of this protest intimate. It was during this session also that he first put himself in direct opposition to Douglas by another protest. The Democrats, in order to enable the aliens, virtually the Irishmen, in their state to vote on 6 months' residence, passed a bill known as the Douglas Bill, remodeling the judiciary in such a way as to secure judges who would aid them. Against this, Lincoln, E.D. Baker, and others protested vigorously, but without avail. Both of these protests, though failures at the time, were in reality the beginnings of two great principles which led to Lincoln's great success, and the realization of his utmost ambition. During his life, defeat was always a step to victory. End of Chapter 2. Recording by John.
Chapter 4 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 4. The great storm of civil war which now threatened the American ship of state had long been brewing. Year by year the party of slave owners, small in number but strong in union, and unanimously devoted to the acquisition of political power, had progressed, until they saw before them the possibility of ruling the entire continent. To please them, the nation, after purchasing, had admitted as slave territory the immense regions of Louisiana and Florida, and in their interests a war had been waged with Mexico. But, so early as 1820, the North, alarmed at the incredible progress of slave power, and observing that wherever it was established white labor was paralyzed, and that society resolved itself at once into a small aristocracy, with a large number of blacks and poor whites who were systematically degraded, attempted to check its territorial extension. There was a contest, which was finally settled by what was known as the Missouri Compromise, by which it was agreed that Missouri should be admitted as a slave state, but that in future all territory north and west of Missouri, above latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes, should be forever free. While the inhabitants of the eastern and western states applied themselves to every development of industrial pursuits, art, and letters, the southerners lived by agricultural slave labor, and were entirely devoted to acquiring political power. The contest was unequal, and the result was that, before the rebellion, the slaveholders, who with their slaves only constituted 1/3 of the population of the United States, had secured 2/3 of all the offices, civil, military, or naval, and had elected 2/3 of the presidents. Law after law was passed, giving the slaveholders every advantage, until Governor Henry A. Wise of Virginia declared in Congress that slavery should pour itself abroad, and have no limit but the Southern Ocean. He also asserted that the best way to meet or answer abolition arguments was with death. His house was afterwards, during the war, used for a Negro school, under care of a New England abolitionist. Large pecuniary rewards were offered by governors of slave states for the persons, i.e. the lives, of eminent northern anti-slavery men. Direct efforts were made to re-establish the slave trade between Africa and the southern states. In 1839 the Abolition Party was formed, which advocated the total abolition of slavery. This was going too far for the mass of the North, who hoped to live at peace with the South. But still there were many in both the Whig and Democratic parties who wished to see the advance of the slave power checked, and their delegates, meeting at Buffalo in June 1848, formed the Free Soil Party, opposed to the further extension of slavery, which rapidly grew in power. The struggle became violent. When the territory acquired by war from Mexico was to be admitted to the Union in 1846, David Wilmot of Pennsylvania offered a proviso to the bill accepting the territory, to the effect that slavery should be unknown in it. There was a fierce debate for 2 years over this proviso, which was finally rejected. The most desperate legislation was adopted to make California a slave state, and when she decided by her own will to be free, the slaveholders opposed her admission to the Union. Finally, in 1850, the celebrated compromise measures were adopted. These were to the effect that California should be admitted free, that in New Mexico and Utah the people should decide for themselves as to slavery, and that such of Texas as was above latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes should be free. To this, however, was tacked a new and more cruel fugitive slave law, apparently to humiliate and annoy the free states, and to keep irritation alive. But on the 4th January, 1854, Judge Douglas introduced into the Senate of the United States a bill known as the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, proposing to set aside the Missouri Compromise. This was passed after a tremendous struggle on May 22nd, and the slave party triumphed. Yet it proved their ruin, for it was the first decisive step to the strife which ended in civil war. It eventually destroyed Mr. Douglas, its originator. He is said to have reported the deed, and when it became evident that the Union was aroused and that the Republican would be the winning party, Douglas went over to it. He had long before invoked destruction on the ruthless hand which should disturb the compromise, and now he put forth his own ingenious hand to do the deed and to take the curse, in both of which he was eminently successful. He was defeated by the honester and wiser Lincoln, and died a disappointed man. To suit the slave party, it was originally agreed in 1820 that in future they, though so greatly inferior in number, should have half the territory of the Union. But as they found in time that population increased most rapidly in the free territories, the Compromise of 1850 was arranged, by which the inhabitants of the new states were to decide for themselves in the matter. The result was an immediate and terrible turmoil. The legitimate dwellers in Kansas were almost all steady, law-abiding farmers who hated slavery. But, from Missouri and the neighboring slave states, there was poured in, by means of committees and funds raised in the South, a vast number of border ruffians, or desperadoes, who would remain in Kansas only long enough to vote illegally, or to rob and ravage and then retire. The North, on the other hand, exasperated by these outrages, sent numbers of emigrants to Kansas to support the legitimate settlers, and the result was a virtual civil war, which was the more irritating because President Buchanan did all in his power to aid the border ruffians, and crush the legitimate settlers. Day by day it became evident that the Kansas-Nebraska bill had been passed for the purpose of enabling the South to quit the Union, and ere long this was openly avowed by the slave-holding press and politicians. The entire North was now fiercely irritated. Judge Douglas, returning westwards, tried to speak at Chicago, but was hissed down. At the State Fair in Springfield, Illinois, October 4, 1854, he spoke in defense of the Nebraska bill, but was replied to by Lincoln with such power as he had never exhibited before. He was no longer the orator he had been, but a newer and greater Lincoln, the like of whom no one in that vast multitude had ever heard. The Nebraska bill, says W. H. Herndon, was shivered, and, like a tree in the forest, was torn and rent asunder by hot bolts of truth. Douglas was crushed, and his brief reply was a spiritless failure. From this time forth Lincoln's speeches were as unexceptional in form as they were vigorous and logical. Never was there a man of whom it could be said with so much truth that he always rose to the occasion, however great, however unprecedented its demands on his power might be. From Springfield Lincoln followed Douglas to Peoria, where he delivered in debate another great speech. Not liking slavery in itself, Lincoln was willing to let it alone under the old compromise, but he would never suffer its introduction to new territories, and he made it clear as day that Douglas, by opening the floodgate of slavery on free soil, had let loose a torrent which, if unchecked, would sweep everything to destruction. He had previously, at Springfield, disclosed the fallacy of Douglas's great principle by a single sentence: "I admit that the emigrant to Kansas is competent to govern himself, but I deny his right to govern any other person without that person's consent." Such arguments were overwhelming, and Douglas, the giant of the West and the foremost politician in America, felt that he had met his master at his own peculiar weapons, oratory and debate. He sent for Lincoln, and proposed that both should refrain from speaking during the campaign, and Lincoln, conscious of superior strength, agreed. Douglas did speak once more, however, but Lincoln remained silent. At the end of this campaign, Lincoln was elected to the legislature of Illinois. As the legislature was about to elect a United States senator, Lincoln resigned to become a candidate. But at the election, there being 3 candidates, Lincoln, finding that by resigning he could make it sure that an anti-Nebraska man, Judge Trumbull, could be elected, and that there was some uncertainty as to his own success, resigned, in the noblest manner, in favor of his principles and party. It had been the ambition of his life to become a United States senator. The result of this sacrifice, says Holland, was that, when the Republican party was soon after regularly organized, Lincoln became their foremost man. Meanwhile, the strife in Kansas grew more desperate. One governor after another was appointed to the state, for the express purpose of turning it over to slavery. But the outrageous frauds practiced at the election were too much for Mr. Reeder and his successor, Shannon, and even for his follower, Robert J. Walker, a man not over-scrupulous. Walker, like many other Democrats, adroitly turned with the tide, but too late. During 1855, the old parties were breaking up, and the new Republican one was gathering with great rapidity. Two separate governments or legislatures had formed in Kansas, one manifestly and boldly fraudulent in favor of slavery, and the other settled at Topeka, headed by Governor Reeder, consisting of legitimate settlers. At this time, August 24, 1855, Lincoln wrote to his friend Speed a letter, in which he discussed slavery with great shrewdness. In answer to the standing Southern argument that slavery did not concern Northern people, and that it was none of their business, he replied, "In 1841 you and I had together a tedious low-water trip on a steamboat, from Louisville to St. Louis. You may remember as well as I do that, from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves shackled with irons. That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio, or any other slave border. It is not fair for you to assume that I have no interest in a thing which has, and continually exercises, the power of making me miserable. You ought rather to appreciate how much the great body of the Northern people do crucify their feelings, in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution and the Union. I do oppose the extension of slavery, because my judgment and feelings so prompt me, and I am under no obligation to the contrary. If for this you and I must differ, differ we must." On May 29, 1856, Lincoln attended a meeting at Bloomington, Illinois, where, with his powerful assistance, the Republican Party of the state was organized, and delegates were appointed to the National Republican Convention, which was to be held on the 17th of the following month at Philadelphia. The speech which he made on this occasion was of extraordinary power. From this day he was regarded by the Republicans of the West as their leader. Therefore, in the Republican National Convention of 1856, at Philadelphia, the Illinois delegation presented his name for the vice presidency. He received a complimentary vote of 110 votes, the successful candidate, Dayton, having 259. This, however, was his formal introduction to the nation. At this convention, John C. Fremont, a plausible political pretender, was nominated for the presidency. As a candidate for presidential elector, Lincoln again took the field. He made a thorough and energetic canvass, and his greatly improved powers of oratory now manifested themselves. Probably no man in the country, says Leland, discussed the main questions at issue in a manner more original and persuasive. Buchanan, the Democratic candidate, was elected by a small majority. The Republican vote was largely increased by many offensive and inhuman enforcements of the fugitive slave law, for it seemed at this time as if the South had gone mad, and was resolved to do all in its power to irritate the North into war. On March 4, 1857, Buchanan, the last slave president, was inaugurated, and, a few days after, Judge Taney, of the Supreme Court, rendered the famous Dred Scott decision relative to a fugitive Negro slave of that name, to the effect that a man of African slave descent could not be a citizen of the United States, that the prohibition of slavery was unconstitutional, and that it existed by the Constitution in all of the territories. Judge Taney, in fact, declared that the Negro had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Against the Constitution, against the memory of the nation, against a previous decision, against a series of enactments, he decided that the slave is property, and that the Constitution upholds it against every other property. This decision was regarded as an outrage even by many old Democrats. In the same year, the slavery party in Kansas passed, by fraud and violence, the celebrated Lecompton Constitution, upholding slavery. By this time, Judge Douglas, the author of all this mischief, wishing to be re-elected to the Senate, and finding that there was no chance for him as a pro-slavery candidate, was suddenly seized with indignation at the Lecompton affair, which he pronounced an outrage. The result was the division of the Democratic Party. He then made a powerful speech at Springfield, defending his course with great shrewdness, but it was, as usual, blown to the winds by a reply from Lincoln. Douglas suddenly became a zealous free-soiler, after the manner admirably burlesqued by Petroleum Nasby, when that worthy found it was necessary to become an anti-slavery man to keep his post office. At this time Douglas made his famous assertion that he did not care whether slavery was voted up or down, and in the following year, April 30, 1858, Congress passed the English Bill, by which the people of Kansas were offered heavy bribes in land if they would accept the Lecompton Constitution, but which the people rejected by an immense majority. On the 16th June, 1858, a Republican state convention at Springfield nominated Lincoln for the Senate, and on the 17th he delivered a bold speech, soon to be known far and wide as the celebrated House Divided Against Itself speech. It began with these words: "If we could first know where we are, and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do, and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation had not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination, piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded of the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision. Let him consider not only what the work the machinery is adapted to, and how well adapted, but also let him study the history of its construction, and trace, if he can, or rather fail if he can, to trace the evidences of design and concert of action among its chief master workers from the beginning. These were awful words to the world, and with awe were they received. Lincoln was the first man among the moderates who had dared to speak so plainly. His friends were angry, but in due time this tremendous speech had the right effect, for it announced the truth. Meanwhile, Lincoln and Douglas were again paired together as rivals, and at one place the latter put to his adversary a series of questions, which were promptly answered. In return, Lincoln gave Douglas 4 others, by one of which he was asked if the people of a United States territory could in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits. To which Douglas replied that the people of a territory had the lawful means to exclude slavery by legislative action. This reply brought Douglas into direct antagonism with the pro-slavery men. He hoped, by establishing a platform of his own, to head so many Democrats that the Republicans would welcome his accession and make him president. But Lincoln, by these questions, and by his unyielding attacks, weakened him to his ruin. It is true that Judge Douglas gained his seat in the Senate, but it was by an old and unjust law in the legislature, as Lincoln really had 4,000 majority. The speeches which Lincoln delivered during this campaign, and which were afterwards published with those of Douglas, were so refined and masterly that many believed they had been revised for him by able friends. But from this time all his oratory indicated an advance in all respects. He was now bent on great things. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 5. It is an almost inevitable law of stern equity in the United States, as it must be in all true republics, that the citizen who has distinguished himself by great services must not expect really great rewards. The celebrity which he has gained seems, in a commonwealth, where all are ambitious of distinction, to be sufficient recompense. It is true that all times some overwhelming favorite, generally a military hero, is made an exception, but there are very few ambitious civilians who do not realize that a prophet is without great honor in his own country. Other instances may occur where aspiring men have carefully concealed their hopes, and of such was Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps his case is best stated by Leland, who declares that he had all the requisites of an available candidate for the presidency, chiefly because he had not been sufficiently prominent in national politics to excite the jealousies of powerful rivals. In order to defeat one another, these rivals will put forward some comparatively unknown man, and thus Lincoln was greatly indebted to the jealousy with which Horace Greeley, a New York politician, regarded his rival, W. H. Seward. Lincoln's abilities were very great, but he knew that becoming modesty in a great man was about as needful as anything else. Therefore, when his friend Pickett suggested that he might aspire to the chief magistracy, he replied, "I do not think I am fit for the presidency." But he had friends who thought differently, and in the winter of 1859, Jackson Grimshaw, Mr. Hatch, the Secretary of State, and Messrs. Bushnell, Judd, and Peck held a meeting, and after a little persuasion induced Lincoln to allow them to put him forward as a candidate for the great office. In October 1859, Lincoln received an invitation from a committee of citizens to give a lecture in New York. He was much pleased with this intimation that he was well known in the East, and wrote out with great care a political address, which, when delivered, was warmly praised by the newspapers, one of which, the Tribune, edited by Horace Greeley, declared that no man ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience. The subject of the discourse was most logical, vigorous, and masterly comment upon an assertion which Judge Douglas had made, to the effect that the framers of the Constitution had understood and approved of slavery. No better vindication of the rights of the Republican party to be considered in expressing and carrying out in all respects the opinions of Washington and of the framers of the Constitution was ever set forth. From New York he went to New England, lecturing in many cities, and everywhere verifying what was said of him in the Manchester Mirror, that he spoke with great fairness, candor, and with wonderful interest. He did not abuse the South, the administration, or the Democrats. He is far from prepossessing in personal appearance, and his voice is disagreeable, yet he wins your attention and goodwill from the start. His sense of the ludicrous is very keen, and an exhibition of that is the clincher of all his arguments, not the ludicrous acts of persons, but ludicrous ideas. Hence he is never offensive, and steals away willingly into his train of belief persons who are opposed to him. For the first half hour his opponents would agree with every word he uttered, and from that point he began to lead them off, little by little, until it seemed as if he had got them all into his fold. Lincoln was now approaching with great rapidity the summit of his wishes. On May 9th and 10th, the Republican State Convention met at Springfield for the purpose of nominating a candidate for the presidency, and it is said that Lincoln did not appear to have had any idea that any business relative to himself was to be transacted. For it is unquestionable that, while very ambitious, he was at the same time remarkably modest. When he went to lecture in New York, and the press reporters asked him for slips or copies of his speech, he was astonished, not feeling sure whether the newspapers would care to publish it. At this convention he was sitting on his heels in a back part of the room, and the governor of Illinois, as soon as the meeting was organized, rose and said, "I am informed that a distinguished citizen of Illinois, and one whom Illinois will ever delight to honor, is present, and I wish to move that this body invite him to a seat on the stand." And pausing, he exclaimed, "Abraham Lincoln." There was tremendous applause, and the mob, seizing Lincoln, raised him in their arms, and bore him, sturdily resisting, to the platform. A gentleman who was present said, "I then thought him one of the most diffident and worst-plagued men I ever saw." The next proceeding was most amusing and characteristic, it being the entrance of old John Hanks, with 2 fence rails bearing the inscription, "2 rails from a lot made by Abraham Lincoln and John Hanks in the Sangamon Bottom in the year 1830. The end was that Lincoln was the declared candidate of his state for the presidency. But there were other candidates from other states, and at the great convention in Chicago on May 16th, there was as fierce intriguing and as much shrewdness shown as ever attended the election of a pope. After publishing the platform, or declaration of the principles of the Republican party, which was in the main a stern denunciation of all further extension of slavery, with a declaration in favor of protection, the rights of foreign citizens, and a Pacific railroad, the convention proceeding to the main business. It was soon apparent that the real strife lay between W. H. Seward, of New York, and Abraham Lincoln. It would avail little to expose all the influences of trickery and enmity resorted to by the friends of either candidate on this occasion. Suffice it to say, eventually, Lincoln received the nomination, which was the prelude to the most eventful election ever witnessed in America. What followed has been well described by Leland. All that day and all the day previous, Mr. Lincoln was at Springfield, trying to behave as usual, but watching, with nervous anxiety, the proceedings of the convention as they were reported by telegraph. On both days he played a great deal at fives in a ball alley. It is probable that he took this physical mode of working off or keeping down the excitement that threatened to possess him. About 9 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Lincoln came to the office of Lincoln and Herndon. Mr. Baker entered, with a telegram which said the names of the candidates had been announced, and that Mr. Lincoln had been received with more applause than any other. When the news of the first ballot came over the wire, it was apparent to all present that Mr. Lincoln thought it very favorable. He believed if Mr. Seward failed to get the nomination, or to come very near it, on the first ballot, he would fail altogether. Presently news of the second ballot arrived, and then Mr. Lincoln showed by his manner that he considered the contest no longer doubtful. "I've got him," said he. When the decisive dispatch at length arrived, there was great commotion. Mr. Lincoln seemed to be calm, but a close observer could detect in his countenance the indications of deep emotion. In the meantime, cheers for Lincoln swelled up from the streets, and began to be heard through the town. Some one remarked, "Mr. Lincoln, I suppose now we will soon have a book containing your life." "There is not much," he replied, "in my past life about which to write a book, as it seems to me." Having received the hearty congratulations of the company in the office, he descended to the street, where he was immediately surrounded by Irish and American citizens. And, so long as he was willing to receive it, there was great handshaking and felicitating. "Gentlemen," said the great man, with a happy twinkle in his eye, "you had better come up and shake my hand while you can. Honors elevate some men, you know." But he soon bethought him of a person who was of more importance to him than all of this crowd. Looking towards his house, he said, "Well, gentlemen, there is a little short woman at our house who is probably more interested in this dispatch than I am, and, if you will excuse me, I will take it up and let her see it." The division caused by Douglas in the Democratic party to further his own personal ambition utterly destroyed its power for a long time. The result was a division, one convention nominating Judge Douglas for the presidency, with Mr. Johnson of Georgia as vice president, and the other, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, with Joseph Lane of Oregon, for the second office. Still another party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts for president and vice president. Thus there were four rival armies in the political field, soon to be merged into two in real strife. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, receiving 1,857,610 votes. Douglas had 1,291,574. Breckinridge 850,082, Bell 646,124. Of all the votes really cast, there was a majority of 930,170 against Lincoln, a fact which was afterwards continually urged by the Southern party, which called him the minority president. But when the electors who are chosen to elect the president met, they gave Lincoln 180 votes, Breckinridge 72, Bell 30, while Douglas, who might beyond question have been the successful candidate had he been less crafty, received only 12. The strife between him and Lincoln had been like that between the giant and the hero in the Norse mythology, wherein the two gave to each other riddles, on the successful answers to which their lives depended. Judge Douglas strove to entrap Lincoln with a long series of questions which were easily eluded, but one was demanded of the questioner himself, and the answer he gave to it proved his destruction. The immediate result of Lincoln's election was such a rush of hungry politicians seeking office as had never before been witnessed. As every appointment in the United States, from the smallest post office to a secretaryship, is in the direct gift of the President, the newly elected found himself attacked by thousands of place hunters, ready to prove that they were the most deserving men in the world for reward. And if they did not, as Artemus Ward declares, come down the chimneys of the White House to interview him, they at least besieged him with such pertinacity and made him so thoroughly wretched that he is said to have at last replied to one man who insisted that it was really to his exertions that the President owed his election, "If that be so, I wonder you are not ashamed to look me in the face for getting me into such an abominable situation." From his own good nature and from a sincere desire to really deserve his popular name of Honest Old Abe, Lincoln determined to appoint the best men to office, irrespective of party. Hoping against hope to preserve the Union, he would have given place in his cabinet to Southern Democrats as well as to Northern Republicans. But as soon as it was understood that he was elected, and that the country would have a president opposed to the extension of slavery, the South began to prepare to leave the Union, and for war. It was in vain that Lincoln and the great majority of his party made it clear as possible that, rather than see the country destroyed by war and by disunion, they would leave slavery as it was. This did not suit the views of the rule or ruin party of the South, and as secession from the Federal Union became a fixed fact, their entire press and all their politicians declared that their object was not merely to build up a Southern Confederacy, but to legislate so as to destroy the industry of the North, and break the old Union into 1,000 conflicting independent governments. Therefore, Lincoln, in intending to offer seats in the cabinet to Alexander H. Stephens, James Guthrie of Kentucky, and John A. Gilmer of North Carolina, made, if sincere, a great mistake, though one in every way creditable to his heart and his courtesy. The truth was, that the South had for 4 years unanimously determined to secede, and was actually seceding, while the North, which had gone beyond the extreme limits of endurance and of justice itself to conciliate the South, could not believe that fellow countrymen and brothers seriously intended war. For it was predetermined and announced by the Southern press that, unless the Federal Government would make concessions beyond all reason, and put itself in the position of a disgraced and conquered state, there must be war. As the terrible darkness began to gather, and the storm signals to appear, Lincoln sought for temporary relief in visiting his stepmother and other old friends and relatives in Coles County. The meeting with her, whom he had always regarded as his mother, was very touching. It was the more affecting because she, to whom he was the dearest on earth, was under an impression, which time rendered prophetic, that he would, as president, be assassinated. This anticipation spread among his friends, who vied with one another in gloomy suggestions of many forms of murder, while one very zealous prophet, who had fixed on poison as the means by which Lincoln would die, urged him to take as a cook from home one among his own female friends. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Schmidt. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 6. A Suspected Conspiracy, Lincoln's Departure for Washington, His Speeches at Springfield and on the Road to the National Capital, Breaking Out of the Rebellion, Treachery of President Buchanan, Treason in the Cabinet, Jefferson Davis's Message, Threats of Massacre and Ruin to the Northern Southern Sympathizers, Lincoln's Inaugural Address, the Cabinet, the Days of Doubt and of Darkness. It was unfortunate for Lincoln that he listened to the predictions of his alarmed friends. So generally did the idea prevail that an effort would be made to kill him on his way to Washington, that a few fellows of the lower class in Baltimore, headed by a barber named Ferrandina, thinking to gain a little notoriety, as they actually did get some money from Southern sympathizers, gave out that they intended to murder Mr. Lincoln on his journey to Washington. Immediately, a number of detectives was set to work. and as everybody seemed to wish to find a plot was found, or imagined, and Lincoln was persuaded to pass privately and disguised on a special train from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to Washington, where he arrived February 23rd, 1861. Before leaving Springfield, he addressed his friends at the moment of parting at the railway station in a speech of impressive simplicity. Friends, no one who has never been placed in a like position can understand my feelings at this hour, nor the oppressive sadness I feel at this parting. For more than a quarter of a century I have lived among you, and during all that time I have received nothing but kindness at your hands. Here I have lived from youth until now I am an old man. Here the most sacred ties of the earth were assumed. Here all my children were born, and here one of them lies buried. To you, dear friends, I owe all that I have, all that I am. All the strange, checkered past seems now to crowd upon my mind. Today I leave you. I go to assume a task more difficult than that which devolved upon Washington. Unless the great God who assisted him shall be with me and aid me, I must fail. But if the same omniscient mind and almighty arm that directed and protected him shall guide and support me, I shall not fail. I shall succeed. Let us all pray that the God of our fathers may not forsake us now. To him I commend you all. Permit me to ask that with equal sincerity and faith you will invoke his wisdom and guidance for me. With these few words I must leave you, for how long I know not. Friends, one and all, I must now bid you an affectionate farewell. It may be observed that in this speech Lincoln, notwithstanding his conciliatory offers to the South, apprehended a terrible war, and that when speaking from the heart he showed himself a religious man. If he ever spoke in earnest, it was on this occasion. One who had heard him 100 times declared that he never saw him so profoundly affected, nor did he ever utter an address which seemed so full of simple and touching eloquence as this. It left his audience deeply affected, but the same people were more deeply moved at his return. At 8 o'clock, says Leland, the train rolled out of Springfield among the cheers of the populace. 4 years later, a funeral train, covered with the emblems of splendid mourning, rolled into the same city, bearing a corpse whose obsequies were being celebrated in every part of the civilized world. Lincoln made several speeches at different places along his route from Springfield to Philadelphia, and in all he freely discussed the difficulties of the political crisis, expressing himself to the effect that there was really no danger or no crisis, since he was resolved, with all the Union-loving men of the North, to grant the South all its rights. But these addresses were not all sugar and rosewater. At Philadelphia he said, "Now, in my view of the present aspect of affairs, there need be no bloodshed or war. There is no necessity for it. I am not in favor of such a course, and I may say in advance that there will be no bloodshed unless it be forced upon the government, and that it will be compelled to act in self-defense." Lincoln had declared that the duties which would devolve upon him would be greater than those which had devolved upon any American since Washington. During this journey the wisdom, firmness, and ready tact of his speeches already indicated that he would perform these duties of statesmanship in a masterly manner. He was received courteously by immense multitudes, but at this time so very little was known of him beyond the fact that he was called honest old Abe the rail splitter, and that he had sprung from that most illiterate source, a poor Southern backwoods family, that even his political friends went to hear him with misgivings or with shame. There was a general impression that the Republican party had gained a victory by truckling to the mob, and by elevating one of its roughest types to leadership, and the gaunt, uncouth appearance of the President-elect fully confirmed this opinion. but when he spoke it was as if a spell had been removed. The disguise of Odin fell away, and people knew the great man, called to struggle with and conquer the rebellious giants, a hero coming with the right strength at the right time. It was at this time that the conspiracy, which had been preparing in earnest for 30 years, and which the North for as many years refused to suspect, had burst forth. South Carolina had declared that if Lincoln was elected she would secede, and on the 17th December, 1860, she did so, true to her word if not to her duty. In quick succession 6 states followed her, there being little or no struggle in those which lay upon the Gulf against the wild tornado of excitement in favor of rebellion. In the border states, says Arnold, in Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri, there was, however, a terrible contest. The Union ultimately triumphed in Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, while the rebels carried Tennessee with great difficulty. Virginia seceded on April 17, 1861, and North Carolina on the 20th of May. Everything had for years been made ready for them. President Buchanan, who preceded Lincoln, a man of feeble mind and entirely devoted to the South, had either suffered the rebels to do all in their power to facilitate secession, or had directly aided them. The Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, who became a noted rebel, had for months been at work to paralyze the Northern army. He ordered 115,000 muskets to be made in Northern arsenals at the expense of the Federal government, and sent them all to the South, with vast numbers of cannon, mortars, ammunition, and munitions of war. The army, reduced to 16,000 men, was sent to remote parts of the country, and as the great majority of its officers were Southern men, they of course resigned their commissions and went over to the Southern Confederacy. Howell Cobb of Georgia, afterwards a rebel general, was Secretary of the Treasury, and, as his contribution to the Southern cause, did his utmost, and with great success, to cause ruin in his department, to injure the national credit, and empty the Treasury. In fact, the whole cabinet, with the supple president for a willing tool, were busy for months in doing all in their power to utterly break up the government, to support which they had pledged their faith in God and their honor as gentlemen. Linked with them in disgrace were all those who, after uniting in holding an election for president, refused to abide by its results. On the 20th November, 1860, the Attorney General of the United States, Jur. S. Black, gave, as his aid to treason, the official opinion that Congress has no right to carry on war against any state, either to prevent a threatened violation of the Constitution, or to enforce an acknowledgment that the government of the United States was supreme, and to use those words of Raymond, it soon became evident that the President adopted this theory as the basis and guide of his executive action. On the night of January 5th, 1861, the leading conspirators, Jefferson Davis, with Senators Toombs, Iverson, Slidell, Benjamin, Wigfall, and others, held a meeting, at which it was resolved that the South should secede, but that all the seceding senators and representatives should retain their seats as long as possible, in order to inflict injury to the last on the government which they had officially pledged themselves to protect. At the suggestion probably of Mr. Benjamin, all who retired were careful to draw not only their pay, but also to spoil the Egyptians by taking all the stationery, documents, and mileage, or allowance for traveling expenses, on which they could lay their hands. Only 2 of all the slave state representatives remained true, Mr. Bouligny from New Orleans and Andrew J. Hamilton from Texas. When President Lincoln came to Washington, it was indeed to enter a house divided against itself, tottering to its fall, its inner chambers a mass of ruin. The 7 states which had seceded sent delegates, which met at Montgomery, Alabama, February 4th, 1861, and organized a government and constitution similar to that of the United States, under which Jefferson Davis was president and Alexander H. Stephens vice president. No one had threatened the new Southern government, and at this stage the North would have suffered it to withdraw in peace from the Union, so great was the dread of a civil war. But the South did not want peace. Every Southern newspaper, every rebel orator, was now furiously demanding of the North the most humiliating concessions and threatening bloodshed as the alternative. While President Lincoln, in his inaugural address, spoke with the most Christian forbearance of the South, Jefferson Davis, in his, assumed all the horrors of civil war as a foregone conclusion. He said that if they were permitted to secede quietly, all would be well. If forced to fight, they could and would maintain their position by the sword, and would avail themselves to the utmost of the liberties of war. He expected that the North would be the theater of war, but no Northern city ever felt the rebel sword, while there was not one in the South which did not suffer terribly from the effects of war. Never in history was the awful curse vae victis so freely invoked by those who were destined to be conquered. It was characteristic of Lincoln to illustrate his views on all subjects by anecdotes, which were so aptly put as to present in a few words the full force of his argument. Immediately after his election, when the world was vexed with the rumors of war, he was asked what he intended to do when he got to Washington. "That," he replied, "puts me in mind of a little story. There was once a clergyman who expected during the course of his next day's riding to cross the Fox River, at a time when the stream would be swollen by a spring freshet, making the passage extremely dangerous. On being asked by anxious friends if he was not afraid, and what he intended to do, the clergyman calmly replied, 'I have travelled this country a great deal, and I can assure you that I have no intention of trying to cross Fox River until I get to it.'" The dangers of the political river which Mr. Lincoln was to cross were very great. It is usual in England to regard the struggle of the North with the South during the rebellion as that of a great power with a lesser one, and sympathy was in consequence given to the so-called weaker side. But the strictest truth shows that the Union party, what with the Copperheads or sympathizers with the South, at home, and with open foes in the field, was never at any time much more than equal to either branch of the enemy, and that, far from being the strongest in numbers, it was as 1 to 2. Those in its ranks who secretly aided the enemy were numerous and powerful. The Union armies were sometimes led by generals whose hearts were with the foe. And for months after the war broke out, the entire telegraph service of the Union was, owing to the treachery of officials, entirely at the service of the Confederates. It must be fairly admitted and distinctly borne in mind that the South had at least good apparent reason for believing that the North would yield to any demands, and was so corrupt that it would crumble at a touch into numberless petty, warring states, while the Confederacy, firm and united, would eventually master them all and rule the continent. For years, leaders like President Buchanan had been their most submissive tools, and the number of men in the North who were willing to grant them everything very nearly equaled that of the Republican party. From the beginning they were assured by the press and leaders of the Democrats, or Copperheads, that they would soon conquer and receive material aid from Northern sympathizers. And there were in all the Northern cities many of these who were eagerly awaiting a break-up of the Union, in order that they might profit by its ruin. Thus, immediately after the secession of South Carolina, Fernando Wood, mayor of New York, issued a proclamation in which he recommended that it should secede and become a free city. All over the country, Democrats like Wood were looking forward to revolutions in which something might be picked up, and not a few really spoke of the revival of titles of nobility. All of these prospective governors of lordly Baratarius avowed sympathy with the South. It was chiefly by reliance on these Northern sympathizers that the Confederacy was led to its ruin. President Lincoln found himself in command of a beleaguered fortress which had been systematically stripped and injured by his predecessor, a powerful foe storming without, and nearly half his men doing their utmost to aid the enemy from within. On the 4th March, 1861, Lincoln took the oath to fulfill his duties as President, and delivered his inaugural address. In this he began by asserting that he had no intention of interfering with slavery as it existed, or of interfering in any way with the rights of the South, and urged that, by law, fugitive slaves must be restored to their owners. In reference to the efforts being made to break up the Union, he maintained that, by universal law and by the Constitution, the Union of the States must be perpetual. It is safe to assert, he declared, that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. With great wisdom, and in the most temperate language, he pointed out the impossibility of any government, in the true sense of the word, being liable to dissolution because a party wished it. One party to a contract may violate or break it, but it requires all to lawfully rescind it. I therefore consider that, in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the States. Doing this I deem to be only a simple duty on my part, and I shall perform it as far as practicable, unless my rightful masters, the American people, shall withhold the requisite means, or in some authoritative manner direct the contrary. He asserted that the power confided to him would be used to hold and possess all government property and collect duties, but went so far in conciliation as to declare that wherever hostility to the United States should be so great and universal as to prevent competent resident citizens from holding the federal offices, there would be no attempt to force obnoxious strangers among the people for that object. Where the enforcement of such matters, though legally right, might be irritating and nearly impracticable, he would deem it better to forego for a time the uses of such offices. He pointed out that the principle of secession was simply that of anarchy, that to admit the claim of a minority would be to destroy any government, while he indicated with great intelligence the precise limits of the functions of the Supreme Court. And he briefly explained the impossibility of a divided Union existing save in a jarring and ruinous manner. Physically speaking, he said, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. A husband and wife may be divorced, and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse either amicable or hostile must continue between them. Why should there not be, he added, a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? In our present differences, is either party without faith of being in the right? If the mighty ruler of nations, with his eternal truth and justice, be on your side of the North, or on yours of the South, that truth and that justice will surely prevail by the judgment of this great tribunal of the American people. It has been well said that this address was the wisest utterance of the time. Yet it was, with all its gentle and conciliatory feelings, at once misrepresented through the South as a malignant and tyrannical threat of war. For to such a pitch of irritability and arrogance had the entire Southern party been raised, that any words from a Northern ruler, not expressive of the utmost devotion to their interests, seemed literally like an insult. It was not enough to promise them to be bound by law, when they held that the only law should be their own will. To those who lived through the dark and dreadful days which preceded the outburst of the war, every memory is like that of one who has passed through the valley of the shadow of death. It was known that the enemy was coming from abroad, yet there were few who could really regard him as an enemy, for it was as when a brother advances to slay a brother, and the victim, not believing in the threat, rises to throw himself into the murderer's arms. And vigorous defense was further paralyzed by the feeling that traitors were everywhere at work, in the army, in the cabinet, in the family circle. President Lincoln proceeded at once to form his cabinet. It consisted of William H. Seward, who had been his most formidable competitor at the Chicago Convention, who became Secretary of State; Simon Cameron, whose appointment proved as discreditable to Mr. Lincoln as to the country, as Secretary of War; Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury; Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy; Caleb B. Smith, Secretary of the Interior; Montgomery Blair, Postmaster General; and Edward Bates, Attorney General. It was well for the President that these were all, except Cameron, wise and honest men, for the situation of the country was one of doubt, danger, and disorganization. In Congress, in every drawing room, there were people who boldly asserted and believed in the words of a rebel, expressed to B. F. Butler, that "the North could not fight, that the South had too many allies there." "You have friends," said Mr. Butler, "in the North who will stand by you as long as you fight your battles in the Union, but the moment you fire on the flag, the Northern people will be a unit against you, and you may be assured if war comes, slavery ends." Orators and editors in the North proclaimed, in the boldest manner, that the Union must go to fragments and ruin, and that the only hope of safety lay in suffering the South to take the lead, and in humbly following her. The number of these despairing people, or croakers, as they were called, was very great. They believed that republicanism had proved itself a failure, and that on slavery alone could a firm government be based. Open treason was unpunished. It was boldly said that Southern armies would soon be on Northern soil. The new administration seemed to be without a basis. In those days no men except rebels seemed to know what to do. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 8. With so much to call for his care in the field, President Lincoln was not less busy in the cabinet. The relations of the federal government with Europe were of great importance. The rebels, says Arnold with truth, quote, had a positive, vigorous organization, with agents all over Europe, many of them in the diplomatic service of the United States. End quote. They were well selected, and they were successful in creating the impression that the Confederacy was eminently a gentleman's government, that the Federal represented an agrarian mob led by demagogues, that Mr. Lincoln was a vulgar, ignorant boor, and that the war itself was simply an unconstitutional attempt to force certain states to remain under a tyrannical and repulsive rule. The great fact that the South had, in the most public manner, proclaimed that it seceded because the North would not permit the further extension of slavery, was utterly ignored, and the active interference of the North with slavery was ostentatiously urged as a grievance, though, by a strange inconsistency, it was deemed expedient by many foreign anti-slavery men to withdraw all sympathy for the Federal cause, on the ground that its leaders manifested no eagerness to set the slaves free until it became a matter of military expediency. Thus, the humane wisdom and moderation which inspired Lincoln and the true men of the Union to overcome the dreadful obstacles which existed in the opposition of the Northern Democrats to emancipation, was most sophistically and cruelly turned against them. To a more cynical class, the war was but the cleaning by fire of a filthy chimney which should have been burnt out long before, and its Iliad, in a nutshell, amounted to a squabble which concerned nobody save as a matter for amusement. And there were, finally, not a few, to judge from the frank avowal of a journal of the highest class, who looked forward with joy to the breaking up of the American Union, because their sympathies were with men, not with monsters, and Russia and the United States are simply giants among nations. All this bore in due time its natural fruit. Whether people were to blame for this want of sympathy, considering the ingenuity with which Southern agents fulfilled their missions, is another matter. Time, which is, happily, every day modifying old feelings, cannot change truths, and it cannot be denied that hostilities had hardly begun, and that only half the slave states were in insurrection, when the English and French governments, acting in concert, recognized the government at Montgomery as an established belligerent power. As to this recognition, Mr. Charles F. Adams, the United States Minister to England, was instructed by Mr. Seward to the effect that it, if carried out, must at once suspend all friendly relations between the United States and England. When, on June 15th, the English and French ministers applied to Mr. Seward for leave to communicate to him their instructions, directing them to recognize the rebels as belligerents, he declined to listen to them. The United States, accordingly, persisted until the end in regarding the rebellion as a domestic difficulty, and one with which foreign governments had no right to interfere. At the present day, it appears most remarkable that the two great sources of encouragement held out to the rebels, of help from Northern sympathizers, and the hope of full recognition by European powers, proved in the end to be allurements which led them on to ruin. Had it not been for the defeat at Bull Run, slavery would perhaps have still existed, and but for the hope of foreign aid, the South would never have been so utterly conquered and thoroughly exhausted as it was. It must, however, be admitted that the irritation of the Union men of the North against England at this crisis was carried much too far, since they did not take fully into consideration the very large number of their sincere friends in Great Britain who earnestly advocated their cause, and that among these were actually the majority of the journalists. To those who did not understand American politics in detail, the spectacle of about one-third of the population, even though backed by constitutional law, opposing the majority, seemed to call for little sympathy. And if the motto of emancipation for the sake of the white man offended the American abolitionists, who were unable to see that it was a ruse de guerre in their favor, it is not remarkable that the English abolitionists should have been equally obtuse. A much more serious trouble than that of European indifference soon arose in the Negro question. There were in the rebel states nearly 4 million slaves. In Mr. Lincoln's party, the Republican, there were two classes of men: the abolitionists, who advocated immediate enfranchisement of all slaves by any means, and the much larger number of men who, while they were opposed to the extension of slavery and would have liked to see it legally abolished, still remembered that it was constitutional. Slave property had become such a sacred thing, and had been legislated about and quarreled over to such an extent, that, even among slavery haters, it was a proof of honest citizenship to recognize it. Thus, for a long time after the war had begun, General McClellan and many other officers like him made it a point of returning fugitive slaves to their rebel masters. These slaves believed the Yankees had come to deliver them from bondage. They were ready to act as guides, to dig, to work, to fight for liberty, and they were welcomed, on coming to help their country in its need, by being handed back to the enemy, to be tortured or put to death. So great were the atrocities perpetrated in this way, and so much did certain Federal officers disgrace themselves by hunting negroes and truckling to the enemy, that a bill was soon passed in Congress, declaring it was no part of the duty of the soldiers of the United States to capture and return fugitive slaves. About the same time, General B.F. Butler, of the Federal forces, shrewdly declared that slaves were legally property, but that, as they were employed by their masters against the government, they might be seized as a contraband of war, which was accordingly done. Nor is it recorded that any of the slaves who were by this ingenious application of law confined within the limits of freedom ever found any fault with it. From this time, during the war, slaves became popularly known as contrabands. It should be distinctly understood that there were now literally millions of staunch Union people who, while recognizing the evils of slavery, would not be called abolitionists, because slavery was as yet legal, and according to that Constitution which they properly regarded as the very life of all for which were fighting. And they would not, for the sake of removing the sufferings of the blacks, bring greater misery on the whites. Badly as the South had behaved, it was still loved, and it was felt that abolition would bring ruin on many friends. But as the war went on, and black crape began to appear on Northern bell handles, people began to ask one another whether it was worth while to do so much to uphold slavery, even to conciliate the wavering border states. Step by step, arguments were found for the willing at heart but unwilling to act. On the 1st January, 1862, the writer established in Boston a political magazine called the Continental Monthly, the entire object of which was expressed in the phrase, "Emancipation for the sake of the white man," and which was published solely for the sake of preparing the public mind for, and aiding in, Mr. Lincoln's peculiar policy with regard to slavery. As the writer received encouragement and direction from the President, and more than one member of the Cabinet, but especially from Mr. Seward, he feels authorized, after the lapse of so many years, to speak freely on the subject. He had already, for several months, urged the same principles in another and older publication, the New York Knickerbocker. The Continental was quite as bitterly attacked by the anti-slavery press as by the pro-slavery, but it effected its purpose of aiding President Lincoln, and the editor soon had the pleasure of realizing that many thousands were willing to be called emancipationists who shrunk from being classed as abolitionists. In this great matter the President moved with a caution which cannot be too highly commended. He felt and knew that the emancipation of the slaves was a great and glorious thing, not to be frittered away by the action of this or that subordinate, leaving details of its existence in every direction to call for infinite legislation. It is true that for a time he temporized with colonization, and Congress passed a resolution that the United States ought to cooperate with any state which might adopt a gradual emancipation of slavery, placing $600,000 at the disposition of the President for an experiment at colonization. Some money was indeed spent in attempts to colonize slaves in Haiti, when the project was abandoned. But this was really delaying to achieve a definite purpose. On August 22, 1862, in reply to Horace Greeley, Mr. Lincoln wrote, quote, My paramount object is to save the Union, and not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my views of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." He had, meanwhile, his troubles with the army. On May 9th, 1862, General Hunter issued an order declaring the slaves in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina to be forever free, which was promptly and properly repudiated by the President, who was at the time urging on Congress and the border states a policy of gradual emancipation, with compensation to loyal masters. General Hunter's attempt at such a crisis to take the matter out of the hands of the President was a piece of presumption which deserved severer rebuke than he received in the firm yet mild proclamation in which Lincoln, uttering no reproof, said to the general, quoting from his message to Congress, "I beg of you a calm and enlarged consideration of the signs of the times, ranging, if it may be, far above partisan and personal politics. This proposal makes common cause for a common object, casting no reproaches upon any. It acts not the Pharisee. The change it contemplates would come gently as the dews of heaven, not rending or wrecking anything. Will you not embrace it?" General J.C. Fremont, commanding the Western Department, which comprised Missouri and a part of Kentucky, had also issued an unauthorized order, August 31st, 1861, proclaiming martial law in Missouri, and setting the slaves, if rebels, free, which error the President at once corrected. This was taken off by a popular caricature, in which slavery was represented as a blackbird in a cage, and General Fremont as a small boy trying to let him out, while Lincoln, as a larger boy, was saying, "That's my bird, let him alone," to which General Fremont replying, "But you said you wanted him to be set free," the President answers, "I know, but I'm going to let him out, not you." To a deputation from all the religious denominations in Chicago, urging immediate emancipation, the President replied, setting forth the present inexpediency of such a measure. But, meanwhile, he prepared a declaration that, on January 1st, 1863, the slaves in all states, or parts of states, which should then be in rebellion, would be proclaimed free. By the advice of Mr. Seward, this was withheld until it could follow a Federal victory, instead of seeming to be a measure of mere desperation. Accordingly, it was put forth, September 22nd, 1862, 5 days after the battle of Antietam had defeated Lee's first attempt at invading the North, and the promised proclamation was published on the 1st January following. The text of this document was as follows: By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. Whereas, on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States, containing, among other things, the following, to wit: That on the 1st day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state, or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward and forever, free, and the executive government of the United States, including the naval and military authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom. That the Executive will, on the first day of January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the States and parts of States, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any State, or the people thereof, shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of this United States, by members chosen thereto at elections wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such State shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such State, and the people thereof, are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and in accordance with my purpose so to do, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the States and parts of States wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which excepted parts are left for the present precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by virtue of the power, and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated States and parts of States are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free, to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that, in all cases where allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States, to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed. L.S. Done at the city of Washington this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and of the independence of the United States of America the 87th, by the President, Abraham Lincoln, William H. Seward, Secretary of State. A true copy, with the autographed signatures of the President and the Secretary of State. John G. Nicolay, Private Secretary to the President. The excitement caused by the appearance of the proclamation of September 22, 1862, was very great. The anti-slavery men rejoiced as at the end of a dreadful struggle. Those who had doubted became at once strong and confident. Whatever trials and troubles might be in store, all felt assured, even the Copperheads or rebel sympathizers, that slavery was virtually at an end. The newspapers teemed with gratulations. The following poem, which was the first written on the proclamation, or on the day on which it appeared, and which was afterwards published in the Continental Magazine, expresses the feeling with which it was generally received. The Proclamation, September 22nd, 1862. Now, who has done the greatest deed which history has ever known? And who in freedom's direst need became her bravest champion? Who a whole continent set free? Who killed the curse and broke the ban? Who made a lie of liberty? You, Father Abraham, you're the man. The deed is done. Millions have yearned to see the spear of freedom cast. The dragon roared and writhed and burned. You smote him full and square at last. O great and true, you do not know, you cannot tell, you cannot feel, how far through time your name must go, honored by all men, high or low, wherever freedom's votaries kneel. This wide world talks in many a tongue, this world boasts many a noble state. In all your praises will be sung, in all the great will call you great. Freedom, wherever that word is known, on silent shore by sounding sea, mid millions or in deserts lone, your noble name shall ever be. The word is out, the deed is done, the spear is cast, dread no delay. When such a steed is fairly gone, fate never fails to find a way. Hurrah, hurrah, the track is clear, we know your policy and plan. We'll stand by you through every year. Now, Father Abraham, you are our man. The original draft of the Proclamation of Emancipation was purchased by Thomas B. Bryan of Chicago for the Sanitary Commission for the Army, held at Chicago in the autumn of 1863. As it occurred to the writer that official duplicates of such an important document should exist, he suggested the idea to Mr. George H. Boker, subsequently United States Minister to Constantinople and to St. Petersburg, at whose request the President signed a number of copies, some of which were sold for the benefit of the sanitary fairs held in Philadelphia and Boston in 1864, while others were presented to public institutions. One of these, bearing the signatures of President Lincoln and Mr. Seward, with the attesting signature of John Nicolay, private secretary to the President, may be seen hanging in the George III Library in the British Museum. This document is termed by Mr. Carpenter in his History of the Proclamation, quote, "The third great state paper which has marked the progress of Anglo-Saxon civilization. First is the Magna Carta, wrested by the barons of England from King John. Second, the Declaration of Independence. And third, worthy to be placed upon the tablets of history by the first two, Abraham Lincoln's Proclamation of Emancipation." End quote. On the 7th November, Messrs. J. M. Mason and John Slidell, Confederate commissioners to England and France, were taken from the British mail steamer Trent by Commodore Wilkes of the American frigate San Jacinto. There was great rejoicing over this capture in America, and as great public irritation in England. War seemed imminent between the countries, but Mr. Lincoln, with characteristic sagacity, determined that so long as there was no recognition of the rebels as a nation, not to bring on a war. One war at a time, he said. In a masterly examination of the case, Mr. Seward pointed out the fact that the detention of the vessel and the removal from her of the emissaries of the rebel confederacy was justifiable by the laws of war and the practice and precedents of the British government itself, but that, in assuming to decide upon the liability of these persons to capture, instead of sending them before a legal tribunal where a regular trial could be had, Captain Wilkes had departed from the rule of international law uniformly asserted by the American government and forming part of its most cherished policy. The government, therefore, cheerfully complied with the request of the British government and liberated the prisoners, No person at all familiar with American law or policy could doubt for an instant that this decision expressed the truth. But the adherents of the Confederacy, with their sympathizers, everywhere united in ridiculing President Lincoln for cowardice. Yet it would be difficult to find an instance of greater moral courage and simple dignity, combined with the exact fulfillment of what he thought was just right, than Lincoln displayed on this occasion. The wild spirit of war was by this time set loose in the North, and it was felt that foreign enemies, though they might inflict temporary injury, would soon awake a principle of union and of resistance which would rather benefit than injure the country. In fact, this new difficulty was anything but intimidating, and the position of President Lincoln was for a time most embarrassing. But he could be bold enough and sail closely enough to the law when justice demanded it. In September, 1861, the rebels in Maryland came near obtaining the passage of an act of secession in the legislature of that state. General McClellan was promptly ordered to prevent this by the arrest of the treasonable legislators, which was done, and the state was saved from a civil war. Of course, there was an outcry at this, as arbitrary and unconstitutional. But Governor Hicks said of it, in the Senate of the United States, "I believe that arrests, and arrests alone, saved the state of Maryland from destruction." When Mr. Lincoln had signed the Proclamation of Emancipation, he said, quote, "Now we have got the harpoon fairly into the monster slavery. We must take care that, in his extremity, he does not shipwreck the country." End quote. But the monster only roared. The rebel Congress passed a decree offering freedom and reward to any slave who would kill a Federal soldier. But it is believed that none availed themselves of this chivalric offer. On the contrary, ere long there were brought into the service of the United States nearly 200,000 black troops, among whom the loss by all causes was fully 1/3, a conclusive proof of their bravery and efficiency. Though the Confederates knew that their fathers had fought side by side with black men in the Revolution and at New Orleans, and though they themselves raised Negro regiments in Louisiana and employed them against the Federal government, they were furious that such soldiers should be used against themselves, and therefore in the most inhumane manner put to death or sold into slavery every colored man captured in Federal uniform. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 9 of Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Danny Hogger Podcast. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 9. 1862, the plan of the war and strength of the armies. General McClellan, the general movement, January 27, 1862. The brilliant Western campaign, removal of McClellan, the Monitor, Battle of Fredericksburg, Vallandigham, and Seymour. The Alabama, President Lincoln declines all foreign mediation. The year 1861 had been devoted rather to preparation for the war than to the war itself. For every day brought home to the North the certainty that the struggle would be tremendous, that large armies must fight over thousands of miles, and that, to conquer, men must go forth not by thousands, but by hundreds of thousands, and endure such privations, such extremes of climate, as are little known in European warfare. But by the 1st of December, 1861, 640,000 had been enrolled. The leading features of the plan of war were an entire blockade of the rebel coast, the military control of the border slave states, the recovery of the Mississippi River, which is the key of the continent, and, finally, the destruction of the rebel army in Virginia, which continually threatened the North, and the conquest of Richmond, the rebel capital. General McClellan had in the Army of the Potomac which occupied Washington and adjacent places, more than 200,000 men, well armed and disciplined. In Kentucky, General Buell had over 100,000. The rebel force opposed to General McClellan was estimated at 175,000, but is now known to have been much less. General McClellan made little use of the spy service and apparently cared very little to know what was going on in the enemy's camp, an indifference which before long led him into several extraordinary and ridiculous blunders. As commander-in-chief, General McClellan had control over Halleck, commander of the Department of the West, while General Burnside commanded in North Carolina and Sherman in South Carolina. But though General McClellan had, as he himself said, a real army, magnificent in material, admirable in discipline, excellently equipped and armed, and well officered, and though his forces were double those of the enemy, he seemed to be possessed by a strange apathy, which, at the time, was at first taken for prudence, but which is perhaps now to be more truthfully explained by the fact that this former friend of Jefferson Davis, and ardent admirer of Southern institutions, was at heart little inclined to inflict great injury on the enemy, and was looking forward to playing the role which has led so many American politicians to their run, of being the great conciliator between the North and South. Through the autumn and winter of 1861 to 62, he did literally nothing beyond writing letters to the President in which he gave suggestions as to the manner in which the country should be governed, and asked for more troops. All the pomp and style of a grand generalissimo were carefully observed by him. His personal camp equipage required 24 horses to draw it, a marvelous contrast to the rough and ready General Grant, who started on his vigorous campaign against Vicksburg with only a clean shirt and a toothbrush. Before long, notwithstanding the very remarkable personal popularity of General McClellan, the country began to murmur at his slowness, and while the President was urging and imploring him to do something, the malcontents through the North began to blame the administration for these delays. It was said to be doing all in its power to crush McClellan, to keep him from advancing, and to protract the war for its own political purposes. Wary by the delay, President Lincoln, January 27, 1862, issued a war order to the effect that, on the 22nd of February, 1862, there should be a general movement of all the land and naval forces against the enemy, and that all commanders should be held to strict responsibility for the execution of this duty. In every quarter, save that of the Army of the Potomac, this was at once productive of energetic movements, hard fighting, and splendid Union victories. On the 6th of November, General U.S. Grant had already taken Belmont, which was the first step in his military career, and on January 20th, Colonel Garfield defeated Humphrey Marshall at Middle Creek, Kentucky, while on January 19th, General G.H. Thomas gained a victory at Mill Spring over the rebel General Zollicoffer. The rebel positions in Tennessee and Kentucky were protected by Forts Henry and Donelson. In concert with General Grant, Commodore Foote took Fort Henry, while General Grant attacked Fort Donelson. After several days' fighting, General Buckner, in command, demanded of General Grant an armistice, in which to settle terms of surrender. To this General Grant replied, quote, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately on your works." End quote. General Buckner, with 15,000 men, at once yielded. From this note, General U.S. Grant obtained the name of Unconditional Surrender Grant. These successes obliged the rebels to leave Kentucky, and Tennessee was thus accessible to the Federal forces. On the 15th of February, General Mitchell of General Buell's army reached Bowling Green, executing a march of 40 miles in 24 hours and a half, performing, meanwhile, incredible feats in scaling a frozen steep pathway, a position of great strength, and in bridging a river. On the 24th of February, the Union troops seized on Nashville, and on February 8th, Roanoke Island, North Carolina, with all its defenses, was captured by General Burnside and Admiral Goldsborough. In March and April, New Bern, Fort Pulaski, and Fort Mason were taken from the rebels. On the 6th, 7th, and 8th of March was fought the great battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas by Generals Curtis and Sigel. who had drawn General Price thither from Missouri. In this terrible and hard contested battle, the Confederates employed a large body of Indians who, however, not only scalped and shamefully mutilated Federal troops, but also the rebels themselves. On the 7th of April, General Pope took the strong position, Island No. 10 in the Mississippi, capturing it, with it 5,000 prisoners and over 100 heavy siege guns. These great and rapid victories startled the rebels, who had been taught that the Northern foe was beneath contempt. They saw that Grant and Buell were rapidly gaining the entire Southwest. They gathered together as large an army as possible under General Albert S. Johnson and Beauregard, and the opposing forces fought, April 6th, the Battle of Shiloh. Beauregard, with great sagacity, attacked General Grant with overwhelming force before Buell could come up. The first day of the battle was in favor of the rebels, but night brought Buell and the moral victory to the Union Army. The shattered rebel army retreated into their strong works at Corinth, but, quote, leaving the victors almost as badly punished as themselves, end quote. General Halleck now assumed command of the Western Army, succeeding General Hunter. On the 30th of May, Halleck took Corinth, capturing immense quantities of stores and a line of fortifications 15 miles long, but was so dilatory in his attack that General Beauregard escaped and transferred his army to aid the rebels in the east. For these magnificent victories, President Lincoln published a Thanksgiving proclamation. But while these fierce battles and great victories went on in the West, and commanders and men became alike inured to hardship and hard fighting, the splendid Army of the Potomac had done nothing beyond digging endless and useless trenches in which thousands found their graves. The tangled and wearisome correspondence, which for months passed between President Lincoln and General McClellan, is one of the most painful episodes of the war. The President urged action. General McClellan answered with excuses for inaction, with many calls for more men, and with repartees. In one time, when clamorous for more troops, he admitted that he had over 38,000 men absent on furlough, which accounted for his personal popularity with the soldiers. Quote, he wrote more dispatches and General Grant fewer than any general of the war. Meanwhile, he was building up a political party for himself in the army and among the northern malcontents, who thought it was wrong to coerce the South. When positively ordered to march or to seize different points, he replied with protests and plans of his own. After the Battle of Antietam, September 16, 1862, President Lincoln again urged McClellan to follow the retreating Confederates and advance on Richmond. A most extraordinary correspondence ensued, in which the President set forth with great clearness the conditions of the military problem, and the advantages that would attend a prompt movement by interior lines towards the rebel capital. In this correspondence, Lincoln displays not only the greatest patience under the most tormenting contradictions, but also shows a military genius and a clear intelligence of what should be done, which indicate the greatness and versatility of his mind. He was, to the very last, kind to McClellan, and never seems to have suspected that the general, quote, whose inactivity was to some extent attributable to an indisposition to inflict great injury upon the rebels, unquote, was scheming to succeed him in his office and intriguing with rebel sympathizers. When at last the country would no longer endure the ever-writing, never-fighting general, he removed him from command November 7, 1862, and appointed General Burnside in his place. Quote, this whole campaign, quote, says Arnold, quote, illustrates Lincoln's patience, forbearance, fidelity to, and kindness for McClellan. His misfortunes, disastrous as they were to the country, did not induce the President to abandon him. Indeed, it was a very difficult and painful thing for him to give up a person in misfortune, even when those misfortunes resulted from a man's own misconduct. But though he spoke kindly of General McClellan, Mr. Lincoln could not refrain from gently satirizing the dilatory commander. Once he marked that he would, quote, very much like to borrow the army any day when General McClellan did not happen to be using it, to see if he could not do something with it, end quote. On the 9th of March, an incident occurred which forms the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. The rebels had taken possession of the steam frigate Merrimac at Norfolk and covered her with iron armor. Sailing down the James River, she destroyed the frigates Cumberland and Congress, and was about to attack the Minnesota when, by a strange chance, there came by the bay a low, turtle-like, nondescript object bearing 2 heavy guns, with which she attacked the Merrimac and saved the fleet. This was the Monitor, built by the celebrated engineer Erickson. There were many in the South during the war who schemed, or at least talked over, the assassination of President Lincoln. On one occasion, when he learned from a newspaper that a conspiracy of several hundred men was forming in Richmond for the purpose of taking his life, he smiled and said, quote, "Even if true, I do not see what the rebels would gain by killing me. Everything would just go on the same." Soon after I was nominated, I began to receive letters threatening my life. The first 1 or 2 made me a little uncomfortable, but I came at length to look for a regular installment of this kind of correspondence in every week's mail. Oh, there is nothing like getting used to things. End quote. General Burnside, who accepted with reluctance the command of the army November 8, 1862, was a manly and honorable soldier, but not more fortunate than his predecessor. Owing to a want of proper understanding and action between himself and Generals Halleck, Meigs, and Franklin, the Battle of Fredericksburg, begun on the 11th December 1862, was finally fought on the 15th January, the Union Army being defeated with a loss of 12,000 men. The spirit of insubordination, of delay, and of ill fortune which attended McClellan seemed to have descended as a heritage on the Army of the Potomac. On May 3, 1861, President Lincoln had, in an order addressed to the commander of the forces on the Florida coast, suspended the writ of habeas corpus. The right to do so was given him by the Constitution, and in time of war, when the very foundations of society and life itself are threatened, common sense dictates that spies, traitors, and enemies may be imprisoned by military power. Inter arma silent leges. Law must yield in war. But that large party in the North, which did not believe that anything was legal which coerced the Confederacy, was furious. On the 27th May, 1861, General Cadwalader, by the authority of the President, refused to obey a writ issued by Judge Taney, the judge who pronounced the Dred Scott decision, the greatest crime in the judicial annals of the Republic, for the release of a rebel prisoner in Fort McHenry. The Chief Justice declared that the President could not suspend the writ, which was a virtual declaration, and that it was illegal to put a stop to the proceedings of the thousands of traitors in the North, many of whom, like the mayor of New York, were in high office. In July 1862, Attorney General Black declared that the President had the right to arrest aiders of the rebellion and to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in such cases. It was by virtue of this suspension that the rebel legislators of Maryland had been arrested and the secession of the state prevented, September 16, 1862. The newspapers opposed to Mr. Lincoln attacked the suspension of the writ with great fierceness, but such attacks never ruffled the President. On one occasion, when the Copperhead Press was more stormy than usual, he said it reminded him of 2 newly arrived Irish immigrants, who one night were terribly alarmed by a grand chorus of bullfrogs. They advanced to discover the enemy, but could not find him, until at last one exclaimed, "And sure, Jamie, I believe it's just nothing but a noise." Arrests continued to be made. Among them was that of Clement L. Vallandigham, a member of Congress from Ohio who, in a political canvass of his district, bitterly abused the administration and called on his leaders to resist the execution of the law ordering the arrest of persons aiding the enemy. For this he was properly arrested by General Burnside, May 4, 1863, and, having been tried, was sentenced to imprisonment. But President Lincoln modified his sentence by directing that he should be sent within the rebel lines and not be allowed to return to the United States till after the close of the war. This trial and sentence created great excitement, and by many Vallandigham was regarded as a martyr. A large meeting of these rebel sympathizers was held in Albany, at which Seymour, the governor of New York, presided. When the conduct of President Lincoln was denounced as establishing military despotism, at this meeting, the Democratic or Copperhead Party of New York, while nominally professing a desire to preserve the Union, took the most effectual means to destroy it by condemning the right of the President to punish its enemies. These resolutions having been sent to President Lincoln, he replied by a letter in which he discussed at length and in a clear and forcible style the constitutional provision for the suspension of the writ and its applications, circumstances then existing. Many such meetings were held, condemning the Emancipation Proclamation and the sentence of Vallandigham. Great complaint was made that the President did not act on his own responsibility in these arrests, but left them to the discretion of military commanders. In answer, the President issued a proclamation meeting the objections. At the next state election, Mr. Vallandigham was the Democratic candidate for governor and was defeated by a majority of 100,000. The year 1862 did not, any more than 1861, pass without foreign difficulties. Mr. Adams, the American minister in London, had remonstrated with the British government to stop the fitting out of rebel privateers in English ports. These cruisers, chief among which were the Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, avoiding armed ships, devoted themselves to robbing and destroying defenseless merchantmen. The Alabama was commanded by a Captain Semmes, who, while in the service of the United States, had written a book in which he vigorously attacked, as wicked and piratical, the system of privateering, being one of the first to oppose that which he practiced afterwards. 3 weeks before the 290, afterwards the Alabama escaped from the yard of the Messrs. Laird at Birkenhead, July 1862. The British government was notified of the character of the vessel and warned that it would be held responsible for whatever damage it might inflict on American commerce. The Alabama, however, escaped, the result of being incalculable mischief, which again bore evil fruit in later days. In the same year, the Emperor of the French made an offer of mediation between the federal and Confederate governments, intimating that separation was, quote, an extreme which could no longer be avoided, end quote. The President, in an able reply, February 6, 1863, pointed out the great recaptures of territory from the Confederates which had taken place. That which remained was held in close blockade, and very properly rejected the proposition that the United States should confer on terms of equality with armed rebels. He also showed that several of the states which had rebelled had already returned to the Union. This despatch put an end to all proposals of foreign intervention and was of great use in clearly setting forth to the partisans of the Union the unflinching and determined character of their government and of the man who was its executive head. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Danny Hogger of Danny Hogger Podcasts.
Chapter 10 of Abraham Lincoln and Abolition of Slavery in the United States. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Abraham Lincoln and the Abolition of Slavery in the United States by Charles Godfrey Leland. Chapter 10. 1863. A Popular Prophecy. General Burnside relieved and General Hooker appointed. Battle of Chancellorsville. The rebels invade Pennsylvania. Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg. Grant takes Vicksburg. Port Hudson. Battle of Chattanooga. New York riots. The French in Mexico. Troubles in Missouri. There was, during the rebellion, a popular rhyme declaring that in '61 the war begun, in '62 we'll put it through, in '63 the nigger'll be free, in '64 the war'll be over, and Johnny come marching home. The predictions were substantially fulfilled. On January 1st, 1863, nearly 4 million slaves who had been merchandise became men in the sight of the law, and the war, having been literally put through with great energy, was beginning to promise a definite success to the Federal cause. But the Union owed this advance less to its own energy than to the great-hearted, patient, and honest man who was at its head, and who was more for his country and less for himself than any one who had ever before waded through the mud of politics to so high a position. That so tender-hearted a man should have been so firm in great trials is the more remarkable when we remember that his gentleness often interfered with justice. When the rebels, by their atrocities to the black soldiers who fell into their hands, caused him to issue an order, July 30th, 1863, declaring that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed, and for every one sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labor. It seemed as if vigorous retaliation was at last to be inflicted. But, as Ripley and Dana state, Mr. Lincoln's natural tender-heartedness prevented him from ever ordering such an execution. Lincoln having discovered in the case of Macmillan that incompetent or unlucky generals could be relieved without endangering the country, General Burnside, after the disaster of Fredericksburg, was set aside January 24th, 1863, and General Joseph Hooker appointed in his place to command the Army of the Potomac. From the 27th of April, General Hooker advanced to Kelly's Ford and thence to Chancellorsville. A force under General Stoneman had succeeded in cutting the railroad in the rear of the rebels, so as to prevent their receiving reinforcements from Richmond, General Hooker intending to attack them flank and rear. On the 2nd May, he met his enemy at Chancellorsville, where, after a terrible battle, which continued with varying success for 3 days, he was compelled to withdraw his army to the north bank of the Rappahannock, having lost nearly 18,000 men. The rebel loss was also very large. General Stonewall Jackson was killed through an accidental shot from one of his own men. Inspired by this success, the Confederate General Lee resolved to move into the enemy's country. On the 9th June, he advanced northwest to the valley of the Shenandoah. On the 13th, the rebel General Ewell, with a superior force, attacked and utterly defeated General Milroy at Winchester. On the 14th July, the rebel army marched into Maryland, with the intention of invading Pennsylvania. A great excitement sprung up in the North. In a few days, the President issued a proclamation calling for 120,000 troops from the states most in danger. They were promptly sent, and in addition to these, thousands formed themselves into improvised companies and hurried off to battle. For in those days almost every man, at one time or another, had a turn at the war, the writer himself being one of those who went out in this emergency. The danger was indeed great, and had Lee been the Napoleon which his friends thought him, he might well enough have advanced to Philadelphia. That on one occasion 3 of his scouts came within sight of Harrisburg, I am certain, having seen them with my own eyes, though no one then deemed it credible. But 2 years after, when I mentioned it to a wounded Confederate colonel, who had come in to receive parole in West Virginia, he laughed, and assured me that, on the day of which I spoke, 3 of his men returned, boasting that they had been in sight of Harrisburg, but that, till he heard my story, he had never believed them. And this was confirmed by another Confederate officer who was with him. On the evening of that day on which I saw the scouts, there was a small skirmish at Sporting Hill, 6 miles south of Harrisburg, in which 2 guns from the artillery company to which I belonged took part, and this was, I believe, the only fighting which took place so far north during the war. And now there came on the great battle of Gettysburg, which proved to be the turning point of the whole conflict between North and South. For our army, as soon as the rebels advanced north, advanced with them, and when they reached Hagerstown, Maryland, the Federal headquarters were at Frederick City, our whole force, as Raymond states, being thus interposed between the rebels and Baltimore and Washington. On that day General Hooker was relieved from command of the army, and General Meade appointed in his place. This was a true-hearted, loyal soldier and gallant gentleman, but by no means hating the rebels so much at heart as to wish to improve them all away from the face of the earth, as General Birney and others of the sterner sort would have gladly done. General Meade at once marched towards Harrisburg, upon which the enemy was also advancing. On the 1st July, Generals Howard and Reynolds engaged the Confederates near Gettysburg, but the foe being strongly posted and superior in numbers, compelled General Howard to fall back to Cemetery Hill, around which all the corps of the Union Army soon gathered. About 3 o'clock, July 2nd, the rebels came down in terrible force and with great fury upon the 3rd Corps, commanded by General Sickles, who soon had his leg shot off. As the corps seemed lost, General Birney, who succeeded him, was urged to fall back, but he, as one who knew no fear, being a grim fanatic, held his ground with the most desperate bravery, till reinforced by the 1st and 6th Corps. The roar of the cannon in this battle was like the sound of 100 thunderstorms, when at 1 o'clock on the 3rd July the enemy opened an artillery fire on us from 150 guns for 2 hours, we replying with 100. And I have been assured that, on this occasion, the wild rabbits, losing all fear of man in their greater terror at this horrid noise, ran for shelter, and leaped into the bosoms of the gunners. Now the battle raged terribly, as it did the day before, when General Wadsworth of New York went into fight with nearly 2,000 men, and came out with 700. Hancock was badly wounded. The rebels fought up to the muzzles of our guns, and killed the artillery horses, as many can well remember. And the fight was hand to hand, when Sedgwick came up with his New Yorkers, who, though they had marched 32 miles in 17 hours, dashed in desperately, hurrahing as if it were the greatest frolic in the world. And this turned the fight. The rebel Ewell now attacked the right, which had been weakened to support the centre, and the fighting became terrible. But the 1st and 6th again came to the rescue, and drove them back, leaving great heaps of dead. Of all the soldiers I ever found these New Yorkers the most courteous in camp, and the gayest under privations or in battle. On the 4th July, General Slocum made an attack at daybreak on Ewell, who commanded Stonewall Jackson's men, but Ewell, after a desperate resistance, was at length beaten. The victory was complete, but terrible. On the Union side were 23,000 killed, wounded, and missing, and the losses of the rebels were even greater. General Lee leaving in our hands 13,621 prisoners. Lee was crushed, but General Meade, in the words of Arnold, made no vigorous pursuit. Had Sheridan or Grant commanded in place of Meade, Lee's army would never have recrossed the Potomac. It is said that President Lincoln was greatly grieved at this oversight, and once, when asked if at any time the war might have been sooner terminated by better management, he replied, "Yes, at Malvern Hill, where McClellan failed to command an immediate advance upon Richmond; at Chancellorsville, when Hooker failed to reinforce Sedgwick; and at Gettysburg, when Meade failed to attack Lee in his retreat at the bend of the Potomac." It is said that General Meade did not know, until long after Lee had crossed, July 14, 1863, or late in the morning, that he had done so. Now I knew, as did all with me, at 2 o'clock the day before, July 13th, when General Lee would cross. We knew that we could not borrow an axe from any country house, because the rebels had taken them all to make their bridge with. For I myself went to several for an axe, and could not get one. During the night I was awake on guard, within a mile or very little more of the crossing, and could hear the thunder and rattle of the rebel ambulances and caissons in headlong haste, and the groans of the wounded, to whom the rebels gave little care. If General Meade knew nothing of all this, there were hundreds in his army who did. But the truth is, that as General Meade was one who would never strike a man when he was down, so, in the entire chivalry of his nature, he would not pursue a flying and conquered foe. This was to be expected from one who was the Sidney of our war, and yet it was but mistaken policy for an enemy which wore ornaments made of the bones of Federal soldiers, whose women abused prisoners, and whose program, published before the war began, advocated the shooting of pickets. Such a foe requires a Cromwell, and in Grant they got him. During this summer of 1863, a part of the battlefield was bought by the state of Pennsylvania, and kept for a burial ground for those who had fallen in the fight. On November 19th, 1863, it was duly consecrated with solemn ceremonies, on which occasion President Lincoln made a brief address, which has been thought, perhaps not without reason, to be the finest ever delivered on such an occasion. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. These simple yet grand words greatly moved his hearers, and among the thousands could be heard sobs and broken cheers. On this occasion, Edward Everett, New England's most polished and graceful orator, also spoke, and this was the difference between them, that while Everett made those present think only of him living in their admiration of his art, the listeners forgot Lincoln, and wept in thinking of the dead. But it is to Mr. Everett's credit that on this occasion, speaking to the President, he said, "Ah, Mr. Lincoln, how gladly would I exchange my 100 pages to have been the author of your 20 lines." Meanwhile, the Army of the West had been far from idle. The great Mississippi, whose arms reached to 16 states, was held by the rebels, who thus imprisoned the Northwest. Those who ask why the Confederacy was not allowed to withdraw in peace need only look at the map of North America for an answer, and to President Lincoln belongs specially the credit of having planned the great campaign which freed the Mississippi. He was constantly busy with it. His room, says Arnold, was ever full of maps and plans. He marked upon them every movement, and no subordinate was at all times so completely a master of the situation. He soon appreciated the admirable qualities of the unflinching Grant, and determined that he should lead this decisive campaign in the West. General Grant had many enemies, and some of them accused him of habits of intemperance. To one of these, endeavoring to thus injure the credit of the general, President Lincoln said, "Does Grant get drunk?" "They say so," was the reply. "Are you quite sure he gets drunk?" "Quite." There was a pause, which the President broke by gravely exclaiming, "I wonder where he buys his whiskey." "And why do you want to know?" was the astonished answer. "Because if I did," replied Mr. Lincoln, "I'd send a barrel or two of it round to some other generals I know of." In January 1863, Generals McClellan and Sherman, commanding the Army of the Mississippi, acting with the fleet under command of Admiral Porter, captured Arkansas Post with 7,000 prisoners and many cannon. On the 2nd February, General Grant arrived near Vicksburg. His object was to get his army below and behind this city, and the difficulties in the way were enormous, as the whole vicinity of the place was a network of bayous, lakes, marshes, and old channels of streams. For weeks the untiring Grant was baffled in his efforts to cut a channel or find a passage, so as to approach the city from the ridge in the rear. He was, as Washburne said, terribly in earnest. He had neither horse nor servant, nor camp chest, nor for days even a blanket. He fared like the commonest soldier under his command, partaking the same rations and sleeping on the ground under the stars. After many failures, the general, with a persistence which has marked his whole career, conceived a plan without parallel in military history for its boldness and daring. This was, briefly, to march his army to a point below Vicksburg, then to run the bristling batteries of that rebel Gibraltar, exposed to its hundreds of heavy guns, with his transports, and then to cross the Mississippi below Vicksburg, and, returning, attack that city in the rear. The crews of the very frail Mississippi steamboats, aware of the danger, with one exception, refused to go. But when Grant called for volunteers, there came from his army such numbers of pilots, engineers, firemen, and deckhands that he had to select by lot those who were to sail on this forlorn hope. And they pressed into the desperate undertaking with such earnestness that great numbers offered all their money for a chance in this lottery of death, as much as $100 in United States currency being offered and refused by those who had had the luck to get what seemed to be a certainty to lose their lives. And these men truly rode into the jaws of death, believing long beforehand that there was very little hope for any one to live. Into the night they sailed in dead silence, and then, abreast of the city, there came from the batteries such a blaze of fire and such a roar of artillery as had seldom been seen or heard in the war. The gunboats fired directly on the city. The transports went on at full speed, and the troops were landed. But this was only the first step in a tremendous drama. The battle at the taking of Fort Gibson was the next. Now Grant found himself in the enemy's country, between two fortified cities, with two armies, greatly his superior in numbers, against him. Then followed battle after battle, and rapid marches, brilliant with gallant charges and deeds of heroic valor, winning victories in quick succession, at Raymond on the 12th, at Jackson, the capital of Mississippi, on the 14th, at Baker's Creek on the 16th, at Big Block River on the 17th, and finally closing with driving the enemy into Vicksburg and completely investing the city. The whole South was in terror, and Jefferson Davis sent messages far and wide, imploring every rebel to hasten to Vicksburg. It was all in vain. After desperately assaulting the city without success, Grant resolved on a regular siege. Then, with tireless energy, with sleepless vigilance night and day, with battery and rifle, with trench and mine, the army made its approaches, until the enemy, worn out with fatigue, exhausted of food and ammunition, and driven to despair, finally laid down their arms, Grant sternly refusing, as was his wont, any terms to the conquered. By this capture, with its accompanying engagements, the rebels lost 37,000 prisoners and 10,000 killed and wounded. The joy which this victory excited all through the Union was beyond description. President Lincoln wrote to General Grant a letter which was creditable to his heart. In it he frankly confessed that Grant had understood certain details better than himself. "I wish to make personal acknowledgment," he said, "that you were right and I was wrong." In this war the rebels set the example of greatly encouraging irregular cavalry and guerrillas, having always an idea that the Northern army would be exterminated in detail by sharpshooters and cut to pieces with bowie knives. This, more than any other cause, led to their own ruin, for all such troops in a short time became mere brigands, preying on friends as well as foes. On both sides there were dashing raids, and at first the rebels, having better cavalry, had the best of it. But as the war went on there were great changes. Cavalry soldiers from horses often came to mules, or even down to their own legs, while infantry, learning that riding was easier than walking, and horse stealing as easy as either, transformed themselves into cavalry, without reporting the change to the general in command. And if they had done so, the chances are 10 to 1 he and all his staff